Out of the Woods by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. Out of the Woods. Out of the Woods, the story of an artless girl, a hungry wolf, and a wonderful grandmother. When you learn that this story begins with the heroine setting off through the woods to visit her grandmother, who was ill, you may guess that it is the familiar tale of Little Red Riding Hood. I must admit that this is what it is, and I warn you that you may count upon a very artless little heroine and a wolf of insinuating manners and glib tongue, but this grandmother will not be eaten up. Nor did Ethel carry a basket containing a little pat of butter and a cake. She had, instead, a large and luxurious box of candied fruit under her arm. And instead of singing through the woods, she wore a sulky and miserable expression. Unfortunately, red hoods are not in vogue, for such a thing would have been notably becoming to her little gypsy face. However, she was young enough and lovely enough to look well in anything, even a sulky expression. She was not without some excuse for her discontented air. Ethel was one of those unfortunate little bones of contention, so often to be found in divided families, and she had been so much disputed over and argued about, and so rarely consulted or even questioned, that she had grown to think of herself as a helpless pawn in an incomprehensible game, where she could never win anything. The disputes had begun long before she was born. Her father's family had that pride of newly acquired wealth, beside which pride of ancestry shrinks to nothing. Indeed, to spring from splendid ancestors may often make one feel a little humble, but to feel that one is vastly more important than any of one's forebears makes for arrogance. The Taylors had objected very much to the marriage of their only son, even when the marriage was made, and there was no earthly use in objecting. They kept on in a very unpleasant way. All the misfortunes which the young man brought upon his wife and child by his recklessness and folly only increased their anger against the victims, and when he died, they all came forward with helpful suggestions as to what he should have done when he was alive. Ethel had been a small girl of 9 then, and not yet looked upon as guilty, but when she refused to leave her mother and take advantage of the offers made by several of the Taylors, she lost their sympathy. Her mother, with criminal selfishness, hadn't made the least attempt to persuade her child to leave her. On the contrary, she had gone back to her own people and had lived with them in quiet contentment. It was to these people of hers that the Taylors so strongly objected. She herself was a quiet and inoffensive creature who gave little trouble, but her parents were Italians and poor, and not ashamed of either of the two things. Dr. Mazzetti had been a professor of Romance languages in a small Western college, but he had become so absorbed in the enormous commentary upon Dante which he was writing, that he found his teaching very much in the way, so he gave up his chair. Mrs. Taylor, the paternal grandmother, had spoken about this. "Of course," she said, not very pleasantly, "it's a good thing to have faith in your husband's work. But suppose it's not a financial success?" "We don't expect it to be," replied Mrs. Mazzetti in her excellent English. "Such work as that is not undertaken for money." "Do you mean to say that you'll permit your husband to give up his—" began Mrs. Taylor, but the other interrupted her. "A man does not ask the permission of others to do what he thinks is best," she said quietly. "I should be ashamed of myself if I were even to suggest that he should sacrifice his life's work on my account." "What about yourself? Aren't you sacrificing?" "I sacrifice nothing," said Mrs. Mazzetti. "I am very, very happy and proud." And so she was. And so was her only child until she married young Taylor. And so she was again when she came home with the little Ethel to live with these simple, gentle people once more. Not for long, however, for she died some 2 years later. Then the arguments and disputes began again, and this time the Taylors won. Children of 11 are pitifully easy to bribe, and while Ethel was still dazed and stricken after the loss of her mother, all these relations competed for her favor. She was petted and pampered as she had never been before in her life. It is regrettable to admit that she liked all of this, liked the toys and the pretty clothes and the indulgence better than the benign and quiet regime of her grandfather Mazzetti, who believed that children should be literally brought up to the level of the wiser and more experienced adults about them, instead of bringing a whole household down to childish standards. He was always very patient and gentle, but he was too fond of talking about Dante, and of relating anecdotes about an Italian poet who insisted upon being tied into his chair so that he couldn't run away from his studies. Moreover, old Dr. Mazzetti had no money to spend upon toys and clothes. The Taylors took no interest in Dante or any other poet, but they took Ethel to the circus, so she said she wanted to live with Aunt Amy, her father's sister. She wasn't aware at the time how terribly she had hurt the Mazzettis. They said very little. Indeed, they discussed it in private, and decided that it was their duty to say very little. Aunt Amy could give Ethel material benefits which they could not give. And if the child preferred that sort of thing, it was, after all, neither unnatural nor unexpected. Each must find his own, said Dr. Mazzetti. What is joy for one is a burden for another. So they let her go, and they did it beautifully, without saddening her little heart with reproaches or tears. She came back to visit them once a month or so, but somehow in her new existence, this quiet old couple had begun to seem very foreign, very unreal. She was abroad with her aunt when Dr. Mazzetti died. Though she grieved for him honestly, she was too young and too busy to nourish any sorrow long. 2. When Ethel Taylor came home at 19, her grandmother seemed like a little ghost from the past, utterly unconnected with her present life. She still went to visit the old lady, and sat in the familiar room in her little cottage, where the bronze bust of Dante appeared to impose a dignified calm. But these visits were nothing but interludes to real life, and real life just now was a miserable thing. The trouble was that Aunt Amy kept on being Aunt Amy, while the childish Ethel and the 19-year-old one were entirely different persons. Aunt Amy wanted her to come out and to be a nice, happy debutante like other girls. But something in Ethel's blood rebelled against that. She called it a modern spirit, and never realized that instead of being modern, it was the old Mazzetti strain, come down to her from people who for generations had not lived by bread alone. She told her aunt that she wanted to be a singer. "That's a charming accomplishment," said Aunt Amy affably. "I mean, I want really to study, for years and years." "Certainly, dear, if you can find the time." "Time," said Ethel. "What else do I ever do but waste time?" "Naturally, you can't neglect your social duties." "Duties!" "Please don't repeat my words in that odd way," said Aunt Amy, a little hurt. "If you want to study singing, there's no reason why you shouldn't, so long as you're not excessive about it." "But I want to be excessive. I want to give all my time to it. I want to be a professional singer." Aunt Amy laughed, not in order to be irritating, but because she really thought it was funny. Not being a woman of much penetration, she told some of her friends about that absurd little Ethel's fantastic idea. As a result, the girl was teased about it. Ethel couldn't endure being teased. She had that queer lack of self-confidence, combined with tremendous resolution and a little vanity, that belonged to young artists, and she felt that she was absurd, although she really knew that she wasn't. She was ashamed to practice now, and at the same time she exulted in her clear, strong, flexible voice. When she was asked to sing, she refused. Yet sometimes, when she knew there were people in the drawing room, she would go up the stairs or through the hall, singing her loudest and sweetest, half terrified, half delighted at the glorious flood of melody that rose from her heart. She didn't want anything else. She couldn't and wouldn't be bothered with social duties. She wanted to work hard all day and every day, until she was mistress of this great gift of hers, until she could sing in reality as she did in imagination. She had fits of black depression when the sounds that came from her throat seemed a mockery of what she intended. At other moments she was in wild spirits, because she was sure she had made a little progress. Her changing humours were so marked that Aunt Amy was gravely perturbed. She felt that Ethel was becoming eccentric, which was the worst thing anyone could be, and she attributed it all to this annoying obsession with singing. In all good faith, she did what she thought best for the girl. She stopped her lessons. Ethel wept and stormed and entreated and argued until she was almost ill, but without moving Aunt Amy. "No," that lady said firmly. "If you'll put all that nonsense out of your head and lead a normal, sensible life like other girls, I'll let you take up singing again in a year." She hoped and believed that within a year's time, such a pretty and delightful girl would surely find something better to think about. Ethel was helpless. She was exquisitely dressed, and she lived in great comfort and luxury, but she hadn't a penny of her own to pay for lessons. Artists, however, even young and undeveloped ones, are very hard to deal with, because they will not give up and be sensible. Instead of resigning herself to doing without what she wanted, Ethel did nothing but think how she could get at least a part of it. Being 19 and rash and terribly in earnest, she was dallying with a singularly unsuitable idea. 3. "Hello, lad," she said, not at all surprised, and apparently not very much pleased at the sudden appearance of a young man on that quiet path through the woods. "Hello, Ethel," he returned, and fell into step beside her. She didn't trouble to glance at her companion. She knew exactly how he looked, anyhow. He was slender and supple and dark and handsome in his way, which was not her way. There were times when the sleekness of his hair and the brightness of his smile and the extreme fastidiousness of his clothes exasperated her. There were other times when his talk about music made her see in him the one sympathetic, understanding person on earth. He had learned to read the signs and to tell which sort of time it was, and he fancied that this was a favorable moment. "Have you been thinking?" he began softly. "Naturally," she said. "I suppose everyone does, once in a while." Young Ladislaw Metz was not easily discouraged. He, too, was an artist. "Do you mind my walking with you, Ethel?" he asked patiently. "I came all the way out from the city on the chance of meeting you here, because I had something special to tell you." She thought she knew what he meant and frowned. But when he began to speak, the frown vanished, and she sat down on the grass to listen. Old Mrs. Mazzetti was waiting and waiting in her chair by the window. All the bright spring afternoon had passed. The sky was blue no more, but faint and mournful as the sun went down. Outside the light lingered, but in the room it was dark, very quiet. Ethel had written to say that she would come early, and for hours the old lady had been watching the road along which her granddaughter must come. It always made her uneasy to think of a girl as young and pretty as Ethel traveling alone. This was one of the very few ideas that Aunt Amy shared with Mrs. Mazzetti. Aunt Amy wanted Ethel to go properly in a motor car, but her niece was so obstinately set on going by train that she had yielded. After all, it was such a trifling matter, an hour's journey to a suburb to visit a grandmother. The good lady never so much as imagined the existence of Ladislaw Metz, or anyone like him. But old Mrs. Mazzetti did. Not that she knew anything of this particular young man, but she had had opportunity in her long life to observe that in such cases there generally was a young man. When Ethel began taking more and more time between the station and the house, the old lady grew more and more sure and more distressed. She said nothing, however, because her grandchild showed no disposition to confide in her, and she knew that more harm than good would result from asking questions. She couldn't get near to Ethel. She had tried time after time, with all her quiet subtlety, to bring about a greater intimacy, to show how steadfast and profound was her sympathy, but Ethel never saw. In fact, Ethel didn't know that she needed sympathy. She thought that all she wanted was to be let alone. Without in the least meaning to be unkind, she ignored the invaluable love that would so greatly have helped her. For the third time the servant came in to light the lamp, and this time Mrs. Mazzetti permitted it. She had given up expecting Ethel for that day. She has forgotten, she thought. In spite of her bitter disappointment, she could still smile a little over the girl's careless youth. The sun had vanished now, and a strange yellow twilight lay over the earth like a sulphurous mist. It was a melancholy hour. The brightness of the little room made the outside world more forlorn and dim by contrast. Mrs. Mazzetti was about to turn away from the window with a sigh, when she caught sight of Ethel hurrying along the road, with a young man. The girl's companion left her when they were still some distance from the house. If the old lady hadn't had remarkably sharp eyes, she would never have seen him. Ethel came in alone. "Grandmother," she said, "I'm awfully ashamed of myself for being so late." She really was ashamed and sorry, but it was not in her nature to invent excuses, and she had no intention of explaining. Mrs. Mazzetti saw all this perfectly, and did not fail to note something defiant in her grandchild's expression. Nevertheless, she meant to come to the point this time. "You were with a friend?" she asked mildly. "Yes, grandmother." "Your Aunt Amy knows this friend?" Ethel tried to imitate that tranquil, affected tone. "No, grandmother, she doesn't. He's just a boy I met at the studio where I used to take singing lessons." "And you think she would not care for him?" "I know she wouldn't," Ethel answered candidly. "I don't care for him so very much myself. But we're interested in the same things, and nobody else is." "In music?" "Yes, he's—" Ethel began, but she stopped. What was the use of going on, and being told again how absurd she was? Mrs. Mazzetti was silent too, but not because she felt discouraged. She was thinking, trying to understand. "You are still always thinking of singing?" she asked softly. Ethel's face flushed, and her young mouth said in a harsh line, "I'm not going to listen to any more lectures," she thought. "No one understands. No one ever will." "This young man is a musician?" her grandmother asked. "Yes, in a way," said Ethel. "Isn't the country pretty this time of year, grandmother?" The old lady looked out of the window at the rapidly darkening sky, against which the trees stood out as black as ink. It seemed to her not at all pretty now, but vast and terrible. "My little Ethel," she thought, "my little bird who loves to sing. What is this going on now, poor foolish little one? What am I to do?" She missed her husband acutely. She missed him always, but more than ever at this instant. Ethel would have listened to him, for everyone did. Quiet and tranquil as he was, there had been an air of authority about him that she had never seen disregarded. Ethel was very still. The lamp threw a clear light on her warm, vivid young face, downcast and plainly unhappy. "If I spoke to your Aunt Amy about those lessons," suggested the old lady. "It wouldn't do the least bit of good, grandmother. I've said everything there is to be said, and anyhow, I don't care now." "Why not, Ethel? Why not now?" "Oh, I don't know," Ethel replied airily. "Let's not talk about it, grandmother. I've brought some candied fruit. You like that, don't you?" The old lady untied the flamboyant package with fingers that were not very steady. While she was doing so, the clock struck 6. "I'll have to go," said Ethel quickly. "I'm sorry I came so late and had such a tiny visit, grandmother, but—" "Wait, my little Ethel. Gianetta will order a taxi." "Oh, no, thanks," said Ethel. "I like the walk." "Not now, in the dark, my dear." "I don't mind the dark. It's really not at all late. I'll—" "No," said the old lady with unexpected firmness. "There must be a taxi, and Gianetta will go with you to the train." Ethel answered politely, but with equal firmness, that she didn't want that. "Come here, my little Ethel," said her grandmother. When the girl stood before her, she took both of her hands. "This friend, this young man, is waiting for you?" Ethel flushed, but she answered with the fine honesty that had been hers all her life. "Yes," she said, in just the sturdy, defiant tone she used to confess a piece of childish mischief years and years ago. "You see me here," said Mrs. Mazzetti, "unable even to rise from my chair. I could do nothing to stop you if I wished. I do not wish, because I trust you. Only I ask you tell me a little." Ethel was more moved than she wished to be. She bent to kiss the soft, white hair. "I'd rather not, please," she said. "If you will remember, my little Ethel, that your mother always came to me, always told me what troubled her. I am very old. I have learned very much, seen very much. I could help you. But you wouldn't, grandmother. You wouldn't like my plan. Then perhaps I could make a better one." Mrs. Mazzetti felt the girl's warm hands tremble and saw her lip quiver. She waited, terribly anxious. "You see," said Ethel, "all I care about is being able to sing. Nobody believes that. No one understands except Ladislaw." "That is the young man?" "Yes, Ladislaw Metz," said Ethel, a little impatient at this interest in the least important part of her story. "He knows what it means to me." "What is he? He sings?" "He's a baritone. He's going to be a wonderful singer some day." "But now? What is he now?" "Well, you see, he's poor, and he can't afford to go on studying just now. So, I don't like to tell you, because you'll think he's not really a musician. He's on the stage." "Ah," said the old lady with perfect composure. "The theater? An operetta?" "Well, no, it's vaudeville. He's been singing awful cheap, popular songs just to keep himself alive. Now he wants a partner for a better sort of turn. An act, you know. We should sing—" "We?" "He's going to give me a chance," said Ethel quietly. The old lady was silent for a moment. I should like to hear about it, she told the girl at last, in a voice that touched Ethel profoundly, a voice so determined to sound cheerful and sympathetic. I can't tell you, grandmother, she said gently, because you'd think it was your duty to tell Aunt Amy, and she'd try to stop me. I don't intend to be stopped. I may never have another chance. I don't care what I have to sacrifice. I'd gladly give up anything on earth for my singing. You can't think what it's like to have that in you, such a terrible longing, to know that you can do it, and to be stopped and turned aside and laughed at. She bent and kissed the old lady again. I've got to go now, grandmother dear, she said with a sob. No, little Ethel, no. I've got to, grandmother. I promised. Ethel, you promised what? The girl was frankly crying now. Goodbye, darling, she said. You've always been my dearest, kindest friend. If I hadn't been a little beast, I'd never have left you. But I am a little beast. I must go my own way. I've got to go. Goodbye, dear. Her hand was on the doorknob. No, Ethel, no, cried the old lady. With one backward glance, tearful, soft, but utterly resolute, the girl was gone. Giannetta, called Mrs. Mazzetti. Giannetta came in from the kitchen with the querulous expression natural to her. She had been the old lady's servant for nearly 20 years. She adored her, and had never found her anything but just, kind, and generous. Nevertheless, Giannetta had a great many grievances, and did not keep them to herself. Telephone, said her mistress, and order me a taxi. You? A taxi? Cried Giannetta. But that is mad. Quick, Giannetta. But you are very ill. With this rheumatism you can't walk. How do you think then that you... Quick, Giannetta. Patience, patience, said Giannetta in her most annoying tone. I order this taxi, but you cannot get into it. It is only a waste of money. No matter. You are the mistress. I telephone. Now, said the old lady to himself, I must get up. Leo always said that what one ought to do, one would find strength for. I must do this. For 1 minute more I shall sit quietly here, and then I shall rise and get myself ready. She clasped her hands in her lap and laid her head against the back of the chair, looking out at the sky, now quite dark. Then with a long sigh she grasped the arms and slowly raised herself to her feet. Giannetta, coming in again, gave a loud shriek. Silence, you foolish one, said the old lady. Get me my cloak and hat. 4. I don't understand you, said Ladislaw in a deeply injured voice. You'll trust your whole life to me, and yet... The little wood was dark and unfamiliar, and he found it very disagreeable to hurry along at the pace she set. And yet you behave, he went on. I'm not trusting my whole life to you, replied Ethel vehemently. I'd be sorry to think there was nothing better than that to trust in. That's not quite the way to talk to the man you're going to marry, is it? He asked. I've always tried my best to do what you wanted. I don't see why you shouldn't trust me. I don't see either, lad, Ethel answered with her discounting frankness. Only somehow you seem so dreadfully strange to me. I never understand you. I know you must be fond of me, or you wouldn't have asked me to marry you. And I know it's a sensible, practical idea if we're going on tour. But I can't. She choked down a sob. I can't feel friendly with you. I don't want you to. I want you to love me. But they ought to go together, she cried. I'm awfully grateful to you, and I love to hear you sing. But I'm afraid. Oh, it's not fair to you, because I know I'll never feel like that. You will some day, he answered, with a patience that frightened her still more. I've got to be honest with you, lad. I'm sure I shall never feel so. It's only because I want this chance so much that I'd do almost anything to get it. I know that if I can once sing in public, I shall be all right, and... He laughed softly. It doesn't go so fast, he said. Nothing does. You will have what everyone else has. 2 failures for each triumph, 2 pains for every joy. You will have hard work, discouragement, anxiety, and a good many other troubles you've never thought of. That's why I ask you to marry me, because you need someone to protect you. If you don't love me, very well, I'll love you twice as much to make up for it. His hand fell lightly on her shoulder. She sprang aside hastily. That did not offend him. He never seemed to be offended or impatient. He was always reasonable, kind, sympathetic. And yet, instead of being pleased or touched by this, Ethel found it disquieting and mysterious. His polite endurance of her changing humors was more like that of indifference than that of love. Of course he did love her. He must. And she was a very fortunate girl to have found, at the very beginning of her career, a man who loved her and who could and would help her so greatly. This first venture was in itself a thing very displeasing to her. It was a vaudeville act of his own devising, in which, with several changes of costume, they would sing snatches from the most popular operas, all woven together to make a silly story. She tried to look beyond that, to the great triumphs of the future. She tried to feel that these triumphs would be ample compensation for the monstrous sacrifice she was making of her life. Once in a while, in a brief flash, she half realized what she was doing. The memory of her mother came back to her, that gentle and quiet woman who had held so steadfastly to her own ideals. No matter how ardent her desire for perfection in her beloved art, no matter how splendid her ambition, Ethel could not be rid of a secret and bitter sense of guilt. It was wrong. She knew it. It was wrong and unworthy to marry Ladislaw. But why? She demanded of herself. I don't care anything about love and men and things like that. Ladislaw knows it, and if he doesn't care, why should I? Anyhow, it's too late now. I've promised, and I'm going to keep my word. Mother would want me to do that. Oh, but if Mother had been here, she would have understood. She would never have let me get into such a dreadful, miserable, heartbreaking situation. If she could come now, just for one little minute, just to say one word. But there was no one there except Ladislaw. The lights of the railway station gleamed before them, and he drew close to her. "Give me one kiss, Ethel," he said, very low. She hated his voice. She hated to have him so near her. She hated herself. The little wood seemed like a black and sinister forest. "No," she said brusquely, as she had often spoken to him before. This time he was not patient and humble. He caught her arm and tried to draw her to him. "You shan't treat me like a dog," he muttered. In growing alarm she stared at him in the dark, and she fancied she saw his white teeth revealed by a wolfish grin. With a violent wrench she freed herself. With the swiftness of terror she ran out of that haunted wood into the safe, bright road before the station. As she stood there, flushed and panting, trying to consider the situation, he came leisurely up to her. "You can't go back now. Not after that telegram you sent your aunt," he said. "There's nowhere for you to go except with me. You haven't even your ticket or your purse. You gave them to me to keep, and I mean to keep them." "I don't care. I'll walk," she retorted in a trembling voice. "Walk where?" he inquired. "You told your aunt you were going away to get married. You'll have hard work explaining that you changed your mind, and you'll have hard work getting home at all without a penny. Come, here's the train. Don't be a little fool." The long, mournful hoot of the approaching engine came to her ears. "Oh, give me my purse," she cried in terror and despair. Oh, please, Ladislaw." "I won't," he said. "If you won't come with me, I'll leave you here alone. You'll be sorry, Ethel. You'll lose your chance to be a singer. And you'll lose more than that. Your aunt won't take this very well." She looked around in anguish. The ticket office was closed for the night, and there were only strangers on the platform. All about the little oasis were the woods and fields and tiny distant houses filled with more strangers. 5. "Ethel!" cried a voice. It was the voice of the one person who would understand and help and solace her. A voice she could never hear again in this world, strong, tender, and clear. "Oh, Mother!" she cried. "Ethel!" It came again, and not the voice of a spirit, but real and close at hand. "It's someone in that taxi," whispered Ladislaw. "Better not answer." "But it's grandmother," said Ethel, astounded. She flew to the old lady like a stone from a catapult. "Grandmother, what are you doing here?" she demanded, wild with delight and relief. "Nothing," replied the old lady serenely. "Present your friend to me." "I—" began Ethel. Ladislaw was already there, hat in hand. "Mr. Metz, grandmother," she said. "Ah, Mr. Metz," the old lady repeated, looking thoughtfully at him. Her calm old eyes seemed terrible to him. "Are you leaving?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment. Then he remembered that Ethel had never seemed to regard her grandmother as especially important. She was old and poor and obscure. What harm could she do? "Yes," he said. "Ethel and I are going to be married. She's already sent a telegram to her aunt in the city to tell her." "You are a rash young man," said the old lady, in a tone almost friendly. "Rash?" he repeated with a frown. "Very," said she. "It is a surprise to me, because I see that you are not American. Americans marry that way, for love. But with the people of Europe it is often different. They think of how they shall live. They wish a dot, a dowry, something more than love. It is very beautiful, this, because the poor little Ethel will never have anything." Metz was too much taken aback to be discreet. "But she will," he said. "Her aunt will—" "Her aunt has only the income of an estate. She leaves nothing to Ethel, and certainly she gives nothing to Ethel when she is the wife of Mr. Metz." "But I thought—" he began. Suddenly the frail little old creature blazed into magnificent wrath. "Be off!" she cried, raising her hand in a threatening gesture. "Away with you, miserable, beggarly fortune-hunter! Wolf! Bestia! Be off!" He started back. She leaned out of the window, her voice wonderfully strong and vigorous for her years. As he retreated, even above the roar of the incoming train, he heard her only too plainly, and was aware that other people heard her too. "Beggarly fortune-hunter! Wolf! Bestia! Away with you!" He was glad to climb on board. The taxi went hastening back along the dark, still roads, and the old lady held the sobbing Ethel tight in her arms. "But what is there to cry about?" she asked, in tears herself. "Foolish little one! You shall stay with me, my little bird, until you are ready to fly away. There was something put by for you to have, later. You shall have it now, for the singing lessons. Why do you cry, then? You shall sing, I tell you." Ethel was silent for a time. "Grandmother," she said, "the first time you called me, I thought it was Mother." The old lady's arm tightened about her. "It's the same voice," she said. End of Out of the Woods. Dogs Always Know by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. Dogs Always Know. Into this dignified love story, Hugh Captain McGregor barges with a grand cargo of humor to match little Leroy's dramatic dog. The lovely little Miss Selby came from Boston, and the large, not unhandsome Mr. Anderson came from New York, and they did not like each other. Indeed, Miss Selby was not very fond, just then, of anyone who did not come from Boston. Sometimes she even went so far as to declare to herself that she did not like anyone at all except the members of one certain household in Boston. It was at night, after she had gone to bed, that she usually made this somewhat narrow-minded declaration, because it was at that time, when she was lying in the dark, that she would most vividly imagine that especial household. Her mother, her grandmother, and her 2 aunts. They were the kindest, wittiest, most delightful, lovable people who ever breathed. And she compared all other persons with them. And, so compared, Mr. Anderson came out very badly. As for Mr. Anderson, the reason he did not like Miss Selby was because she obviously did not like him. He was a little sensitive about being liked. He almost always had been in the past, and when he saw Miss Selby's eyes resting on him, with that look which meant that she was mentally comparing him with her mother, her grandmother, and her 2 aunts, he felt chilled to the bone. Not that he looked chilled. On the contrary, his face grew red, and he fancied that his neck, his ears, and his hands did also. He justly resented this. It was not his fault that he was sitting at her table. It wasn't her table, anyhow. Purely by luck had she sat alone at it so long. It was the only place left in the dining room, and the landlady told him to sit there. As he pulled out his chair, he said, "Good evening," with a friendly and unsuspicious smile, and Miss Selby glanced up at him as if she were surprised to hear a human voice issuing from this creature, and bent her head in something probably intended to be a nod. Naturally, he did not speak again. But as he sat facing her, and with his back to the room, he could not help his eyes resting upon her from time to time. And it was then that he had encountered that chilly look. It was very pitiful, he thought, to see one as young as she behaving in such a way. Really pitiful. Because she was not unattractive. Even a casual glance had informed him of that. Dark-browed she was, and dark-eyed, but with hair that was bright and soft and almost blonde, and a lovely rose color in her cheeks. The sort of girl a man would admire if there had been the true womanly gentleness in her aspect. But after that look, it was impossible to admire. He could only pity. Strange as it may seem, Miss Selby pitied him, and for a somewhat illogical reason. She saw pathos in the man because he was so large, so much too large. His great shoulders towered above the table. Knives and forks looked like toys in his lean brown hands, and his face was invisible, unless she raised her eyes, which she did not intend to do again. She had seen him, though, as he crossed the room, and she might have thought him not bad-looking if he had not come to sit at her table. It was an honest, alert young face, healthily tanned with warm grey eyes, and a crest of wheat-coloured hair above his forehead. But when he did sit down at her table, she immediately began her usual comparisons. She imagined this young man in that sitting room in Boston, and she saw clearly how much too large he was. It was a small room, and her mother and her grandmother and her 2 aunts were all of a nice, neat, polite size. Like a bull in a china shop, she thought, imagining him among them. This was unjust. It is never fair to judge bulls by their possible behavior in china shops anyhow. They seldom go into them, and when seen in the fields or in bullfights and so on, they are really noble animals. But this is what she did think, and as soon as she could finish her dinner she arose, and with another of those almost imperceptible nods, she went away. She went up to her own room and began to study shorthand. She did this every evening with great earnestness, for she was very anxious to get a better position than the one she had now, and she was so far advanced in her study that she could write absolutely anything in shorthand, if you gave her time enough. She could often read what she had written, too. As for Mr. Anderson, he also went up to his room, but not to study. He had had all he wanted of that at college, nor did he need to worry about a better position. The one he had was good, and he was confident that he would have a better one next year, and a still better one the year after that, and so on, until he was one of the leading paper manufacturers in the country, if not the leading one. He had just been made assistant superintendent of a paper mill in this little town, and he had come out in the most hopeful and cheerful humor. The hope and cheer had fled now. He felt profoundly dejected. He had no friends here, and if other people were like that girl, he would never have any. For all he knew, there might be something repellent in his manner which his old friends had kindly overlooked. He began to think sorrowfully of those old friends, of the little flat he had had in New York, with 2 other fellows, such nice fellows, such a nice flat. When you looked out of the window there, you saw a facade of other windows with shaded lamps in them, and the shadows of people passing back and forth. And down below in the street more people, and taxis, and big, quiet, smooth-running private cars, and all the familiar city sounds. And here, outside this window, there were trees. Nothing but trees. He had heard often enough about the loneliness of country dwellers when in a great city, but he felt that it was not to be compared with the loneliness of a city dweller among trees. He got up and went to the window, and he couldn't even see a human creature, only those sentinel trees moving a little against the pale and cloudy sky. It was a May night, and the air that blew on his face was a May air, a wonderful thing, filled with tender and exquisite perfumes, so cool and sweet that he grew suddenly sick of his tobacco-scented room, and decided to go out on the veranda. What happened was a coincidence, but it would surely have happened sooner or later. He met Miss Selby. As soon as he had stepped outside, she opened the door and came out too. There was an electric light in the ceiling of this veranda which gave it a singularly cheerless appearance, rather like the deck of a deserted ship, with the chairs all drawn up along the wall. There was nobody else there, and Mr. Anderson stood directly under the light so that she could see him very plainly. She said, "Oh!" and drew back hastily, putting her hand on the doorknob. This was a little too much. "Look here," said Mr. Anderson crisply. "Don't go in on my account. I'll go myself." Now, Miss Selby was not really haughty or disagreeable. Simply, she had been brought up on all sorts of Red Riding Hood tales, in which all the trouble was caused by giving encouragement to strangers. She had been taught that it was a mad, reckless thing to acknowledge the existence of persons whose grandparents had not been known, and favorably known, to her grandparents. But certainly she had no desire to offend anyone, and this stranger did seem to be offended. So she said, "Oh no, you mustn't think of such a thing." She meant it kindly, But unfortunately she was utterly unable to speak in a natural way to a stranger. In reality she was a poor, homesick, affectionate, kind-hearted young girl of 20, who, not 15 minutes before, had been weeping from sheer loneliness. But she spoke in what seemed to him an obnoxiously condescending and superior tone. He was a young man of many excellent qualities, but meekness was not one of them, and he resented this tone. So he spoke with an air of amused indulgence, as if he thought her such a funny little thing. "I don't want to drive you away, you know." She raised her eyebrows. "Why, of course not," she said, just as much amused as he was, and sat down in one of the chairs against the wall. She sat there, and he stood opposite her, leaning against the railing, both of them silently not liking each other. Presently the silence became unbearable. "The spring has come early this year," observed Miss Selby. Mr. Anderson, the city dweller, knew precious little about what was expected of spring, but he was determined to say something, anything. "Yes," he agreed. "They were selling violets in the streets yesterday." Miss Selby looked at him with a sort of horror. Was that his idea of spring? Violets being sold on street corners? "But that doesn't mean anything," she cried. "They were probably hothouse violets anyway. You can't possibly see the real spring unless you go in the woods." She needn't think she owned the spring. Every year of his life he had spent several weeks in the country at various hotels. He had seen any number of woods, had walked in them, and admired them too, with moderation, however. "Yes, I know," he admitted. "Last June I motored up through Connecticut." "Oh, but that's different," she explained. "Motoring, that's not the same thing at all. There's a little wood near here. I go there almost every Sunday. I wish you could see it." "I'd like to," he replied, without realizing the step implied. They were both dismayed by what had happened. Miss Selby arose hastily. "Well, good night," she said, and fled upstairs to her room in a panic. Heavens, she thought. Did he think I wanted him to come with me tomorrow? Oh dear, how awfully awkward. Oh, I do hope it will rain. Mr. Anderson, left by himself, lit his pipe. After that, he mused, of course I'll have to ask her to let me go with her tomorrow. That's only common courtesy. Very well, he was willing to make the sacrifice. 2. It did not rain the next day. On the contrary, it was as bright and blithe a day as ever dawned. There was no plausible reason why a person who went into the woods almost every Sunday should not go today. It would be too rude just to walk off if he thinks I meant him to come along, thought Miss Selby. But perhaps he won't say anything more about it. He did not appear in the dining room while she ate her breakfast. Probably he's still asleep, she thought, with that pardonable pride everyone feels at being up before someone else. He was not asleep. On the contrary, he was looking at her that very moment as she sat down at her precious table, eating the Sunday morning coffee ring. He had breakfasted early on purpose, hoping that by doing so he would avoid her. For the more he meditated upon her behavior, the more sternly did he disapprove of it, and he had come downstairs this morning resolved to be merely polite. He could not help sitting at her table. Certainly he didn't want to, and she had no right to treat him as if he were an annoying intruder. But no matter what she did, he intended to be polite. And as he sat on the veranda railing and observed her through the window, he thought that perhaps it would not be so very difficult to be polite to her. She looked rather nice this morning in her neat dark dress, with the sun touching her brown hair to a warm brightness and a sort of Sunday tranquillity about her. He felt a chivalrous readiness to take a walk in the woods with her. She might even point out all the flowers and tell him facts about them if she liked. She arose, and he turned his head and contemplated the landscape, so that he would not be looking at her when she came out of the door. Only she didn't come. Although he kept his head turned aside for a long time, he heard no sound of a door opening or of footsteps. Nothing but the subdued voices of the 4 ladies who sat on the veranda, enjoying the sunshine. He glanced toward the dining room. She was not there. Very well, probably she had changed her mind, and he would not be called upon to be chivalrous after all. He would have the whole day to himself, the whole immensely long, blank, solitary day. Miss Selby, however, had simply gone upstairs to put on her hat. Or rather, she put on 3 hats, one after the other, 2 rather old ones and 1 quite new. She decided in favor of an old one, and felt somewhat proud of herself for this, because didn't it show how little she cared about strangers? If it happened to be a singularly becoming hat, she couldn't help it. She went downstairs and out on the veranda, and there he was, even bigger, she thought, than he had been last evening. A tremendous creature, fairly towering above all the old ladies, and looking most alarmingly masculine and strange. Something like panic seized her. He was so absolutely a stranger. She knew nothing whatever about him. He might be the most undesirable acquaintance that ever breathed. But when he said good morning, she had to answer, and, in answering, had to look at him, and was obliged to admit that his face was not exactly sinister. "Off for a stroll?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Yes, I am." There was a silence, then chivalry required Mr. Anderson to speak. "Well," he said, "if you don't mind, I'd be very pleased." "Oh, certainly," said Miss Selby. So off they went together. They went across the lawn and down the road, and after the first moment of awkwardness, they got on very well. Indeed, it was extraordinary to see how many topics they thought alike. They both agreed that it was a beautiful morning, that the spring was the best time of the year, and that the smell of pine needles warm in the sun was unique and delightful, and that Mrs. Brown's coffee was very, very bad. Then, according to Miss Selby's directions, they turned off the highway and entered the wood. It was not a thick and sombre wood, but a lovely little glade where slim silver birches grew, among bigger and more stalwart trees, standing well spaced, so that the sun came through the budding branches, making a delicate arabesque of light and shadow. It was all so fresh, so verdant, so joyous, like one of those half-enchanted forests through which knights used to ride, long ago when the world was younger. It was so serene and yet so gay that even Mr. Anderson, the champion of cities, was captivated. He walked through that wood with Miss Selby. He saw how she looked when she found violets growing, saw her, so to speak, in her natural habitat where she belonged, and that seemed to him something not easily to be forgotten. There was Miss Selby down on her knees picking violets, Miss Selby looking up at him with that lovely color in her cheeks, her clear, candid eyes asking him if they weren't the prettiest things. He answered no, with considerable emphasis, but somehow she did not trouble to ask him what he meant. She fancied that Mr. Anderson appeared to better advantage in the woods. Seen among the trees, he didn't seem too large. Indeed, with his blond crest, his mighty shoulders, his long, easy stride, he was not in the least like a bull in a china shop, but a notably fine-looking young fellow. In short, when Miss Selby and Mr. Anderson returned to the boarding-house for the midday dinner, they no longer disliked each other. 3. The old ladies had noticed this at once, and it pleased them. They saw Miss Selby and Mr. Anderson talking cheerfully to each other at the little table, and they said to one another, young people, and they were old enough to understand what that meant. The young people themselves did not understand. They didn't even know that they were especially young, and certainly they saw nothing charming or interesting in the fact that they were sitting at a small table and talking to each other. They were, at heart, a little uneasy because they had stopped disliking each other. Dislike was such a neat, definite, vigorous thing to feel, and when it melted away, it left such a disturbing vagueness. Of course, Miss Selby knew that she could not possibly like a stranger. The most she would allow herself was not to dislike him, and simply not disliking a person is a very unsatisfactory state of mind. It couldn't be helped, however. The dislike was gone, and there they sat, not disliking each other, every single evening at that little table. Naturally they talked, and naturally, being at such close quarters, they watched each other what time they talked, and when you do that, it is extraordinary what a number of things you learn without being told. The little shadow that flits across a face, the smile that is on the lips and not in the eyes, the brave words and the anxious glance. These things are eloquent. For instance, Miss Selby talked about that unique household in Boston. She did not say much, that wasn't her way. Yet Mr. Anderson deduced that the mother, the grandmother, and the 2 aunts were, so to speak, besieged in their Bostonian home, that the wolf was at their door, and that Miss Selby was engaged in keeping him at a safe distance, and that she was probably the pluckiest, finest girl who had ever lived, struggling on all by herself, homesick and lonely, and so young and little. As for him, he talked chiefly about the manufacture of paper. Until now, this subject had not been a particular hobby of Miss Selby's, but the more she heard about it, the more she realized what an interesting and fascinating topic it was. What is more, while Mr. Anderson talked about paper, he told her, without knowing it, many other things. She learned that he was a very likable young fellow with a great many friends, and yet was sometimes a little lonely because he had no one of his own. That he was prodigiously ambitious, yet found his successful progress in the paper business a little melancholy sometimes, because no one else was very much affected by it. He said he had been brought up by an aunt who had given him an expensive education and a great many advantages. He spoke most dutifully of this aunt, of all that he owed her. Yet Miss Selby felt certain that this aunt was a very disagreeable sort of person, who never let people forget what they owed her. Very different from Miss Selby's aunts. She had even begun to think that perhaps her aunts, together with her mother and grandmother, might like Mr. Anderson in spite of his size. And then he spoiled everything. To be sure, he thought it was she who spoiled everything, but she knew better. It was his lamentable, his truly deplorable masculine vanity. This man who appeared so independent, so intelligent. This disillusioning incident took place on the second Sunday of their acquaintance, the Sunday after that first walk. Almost as a matter of course they set forth upon another walk, and as it was a bright windy day, rather too cool for sauntering in the woods, they went along the highway at a brisk pace. The spring had capriciously withdrawn, the burgeoning branches were flung about wildly against a sky blue, clear, and cold. The ground underfoot felt hard. Everything gentle, promising, and beguiling had gone out of the world. And perhaps this affected Miss Selby. Her cheeks were very rosy, her eyes shining, and she was in high spirits, even to the point of teasing Mr. Anderson a little. He found this singularly agreeable. For the most part, he could see nothing but the top of her hat, coming along briskly beside him. But every now and then she glanced up, and each time she did so he felt a little dazzled, because of the radiance there was about her this day. He thought, but how glad he was later on that he had kept his thoughts to himself. There was a steep hill before them, and they went at it with that feeling of pleasant excitement one has about new hills. They wanted to get to the top and see what was on the other side. And very likely they were a sort of allegory of youth, which always wants to get to the top of the hills and hopes to find something much better on the other side. But this idea did not occur to them, and alas, they never reached the top. Halfway up that hill there was a garden with a stone wall about it, a wide lawn ornamented with dwarf firs, a fine garden of the formal sort, but not very interesting. And Miss Selby and Mr. Anderson were not interested. They would have passed by with no more than a casual glance, but as they drew near the gate, a dog began to bark in a desperate and violent fashion, and a sweet and plaintive voice said, "Oh, Sandy, stop, you naughty boy." Naturally, they both turned their heads then, and they saw Mrs. Granger standing behind the gate. At that time they did not know her name was Mrs. Granger, or any other facts about her. But Miss Selby always believed that, at that first glance, she learned more about Mrs. Granger than certain other people ever learned in weeks of acquaintance. A charming little lady Mrs. Granger was, dark and fragile, very plaintive, very gentle, the sort of woman a really chivalrous man feels sorry for, especially at that moment when she was having such a very bad time with that dog. It was a rough and unruly young dog, a collie and a fine specimen too, but ill-trained. She was holding him by the collar, and he was struggling to get free, and barking furiously, his jaws snapping open and shut as if jerked by a string, his whole body vibrating with his unreasonable emotional outburst. "Keep quiet," said she, with a pathetic attempt at severity, and when he did not obey, she gave him a sort of dab on the top of the head. It was more than his proud spirit would endure. He broke away from her, jumped over the low gate, and flew at Mr. Anderson. But not in anger. On the contrary, he was wild with delight. He rushed round and round the young man, lay down on his shoes, licked his hands, and when Mr. Anderson patted him, he was fairly out of his mind and rolled in the dust. "Oh," cried Mrs. Granger, "but how wonderful!" She turned to Miss Selby. "Isn't it wonderful?" "Isn't what?" inquired Miss Selby. "I'm afraid I don't." "That strange instinct that animals have," Mrs. Granger explained solemnly. "What instinct?" asked Miss Selby politely. "I thought he was just a friendly little dog." "Oh, but he's not friendly with everyone," cried Mrs. Granger. "Not by any means." It was at this point that Miss Selby's disillusionment began. She looked at Mr. Anderson, expecting to find him looking amused, and instead of that he was pleased, a little embarrassed, but certainly pleased. Then the charming little lady spoke again, addressing Miss Selby. "What darling wild roses!" she exclaimed. "I do wish I could find some." "They're azaleas," said Miss Selby, "and the woods at the foot of the hill, next to your garden, are full of them." Mr. Anderson was not looking at them just then, but only heard their voices, and he was very much impressed by the contrast. One of them had sounded so gentle and sweet, and the other so chill and curt. It was deplorable that Miss Selby should be so ungracious. He was disappointed. So he thought that he, at least, would be decently civil to the poor little woman, and he turned toward her with the intention, only he could think of nothing to say. He smiled, though, and Mrs. Granger smiled at him, and Miss Selby observed this. And Mrs. Granger knew that Miss Selby observed this, and she smiled at Miss Selby. It was a smile that Mr. Anderson would never understand. "I wish you'd both come in and look at my garden," said Mrs. Granger wistfully. Began Mr. Anderson cheerfully, but Miss Selby interrupted. "Thank you," she said, "but I must go home now. Good morning." And she actually set off down the hill. Mr. Anderson, of course, was obliged to follow, and the dog Sandy had the same idea. "Go home, old fellow," the young man commanded. Sandy gave a yelp of joy at being addressed and stood expectantly beside him, grinning dog-wise into his face. Mr. Anderson again ordered him home, and Mrs. Granger called him, but he did not go. He had to be dragged back by the collar and held, while Mrs. Granger fastened a leash to his collar. "I never saw anything like it," she declared. "He's simply devoted to you." "Dogs generally take to me," the young man admitted. Mrs. Granger raised her soft dark eyes to his face. "I think that's a very wonderful thing," she said quietly, "because I'm sure they know. I'd trust Sandy's judgment against any human beings." "Oh, well," Mr. Anderson remarked, grown very red. "You must come and see Sandy again some day," she suggested. "Poor little doggy." "I will," said he. "Yes, thanks very much. I will." All this had taken considerable time, and Miss Selby was nowhere to be seen. He hurried after her, and, turning the corner at the foot of the hill, saw her marching briskly along ahead of him. She must have known that he would follow, yet she did not look back once, and when he reached her side she said nothing. Neither did he. They went on. Presently Miss Selby began to talk, making a very obvious effort to be polite. Mr. Anderson did not like this, but he too made an equally obvious effort at politeness, and succeeded quite as well as she did, and they continued in this formal, almost stately tone for some time. When she looked back upon it, Miss Selby was always at a loss to understand just how and when this correct tone had vanished from their conversation and the quarrel had begun. For it was a quarrel, a genuine and hearty one. And although Mrs. Granger was never once mentioned, yet the quarrel was about her. Miss Selby declared flatly that dogs did not have any wonderful instinct for judging people. Mr. Anderson said he knew they did. "What?" she cried. "You don't mean to say you think a dog knows by instinct whether anyone is good or bad?" "That's exactly what I do mean," he declared. Then Miss Selby laughed. She regretted it afterward, but it was done. She had laughed at Mr. Anderson, and he resented it deeply. They walked side by side for half a mile and never said one single word, and by the time they reached the boarding-house they had firmly established that worst of all complications, an angry silence. It was now impossible for either of them to speak. 4. It was impossible to break that silence without an intolerable sacrifice of pride, yet so very, very small a thing would have sufficed. One entreating glance from Mr. Anderson, and Miss Selby would have responded willingly. Just a shade of warmth in her smile, and the young man would have made an impetuous apology. But he was not going to give entreating glances to persons who laughed at him, and her smile showed no warmth at all, but instead an extreme chillness. They smiled when they met every evening in the dining-room, simply to keep up appearances, and it was a complete failure. The old ladies noticed at once that something had gone wrong. They discussed it with unflagging interest all week, wondering what had happened and whose fault it was. They all hoped that matters would be adjusted by Sunday. Sunday came, and it was a sweet, bright, warm day. The hour for taking walks came, and Mr. Anderson went out, alone. The old ladies were truly sorry to see this. Miss Selby also saw it. She came out on the veranda just as he was going down the steps, and, although she did not turn her head, she had caught a glimpse of his tall, broad-shouldered figure going off, alone. She had a book with her, and, sitting down in a sheltered corner, she began to read. It was impossible. On this gay spring morning, nothing in printed books could interest her. Not that she cared what Mr. Anderson did or where he went. Only she was homesick and so very lonely. There was nobody to talk to, and it would be such a long, long time before she could afford to take a vacation and go back to Boston to see her own people. Good morning," said Mr. Quincy in his apologetic way. For 2 months, Mr. Quincy had been apologetically making attempts to talk to Miss Selby. He was a most inoffensive young man, a teller in the local bank. He had virtually all the virtues there are: thrift, industry, sobriety, honesty, and he knew people in Boston. Yet hitherto Miss Selby had discouraged him, for no good reason at all, but simply because she wished to do so. Imagine his surprise and delight when this morning she replied to him with something like cordiality. The old lady saw him sit down on the railing near her chair. They saw his pleased smile, and they decided that Miss Selby was a fickle and heartless girl. Then presently they saw Miss Selby go out for a walk with Mr. Quincy. In the meantime, Mr. Anderson was striding along the quiet country roads at a tremendous pace. No, he did not like the country. Except for his unique and wonderful paper mill, he could wish with all his heart that he was back in the city, where there were numbers of people he knew, friendly faces to see, jolly voices to hear. He could think of no particular person he was especially anxious to see. Yet it seemed to him that he missed somebody, badly. So he went up that hill again. Again Sandy was there, and Mrs. Granger. Again he was invited to look at the garden, and this time he accepted. 5. Mrs. Granger was a widow, and she admitted herself that the loss of Mr. Granger had made her very sympathetic. She told Mr. Anderson that she understood, and he firmly believed this without exactly knowing what there was to be understood. Anyhow, her manner was wonderfully soothing to one who had recently been laughed at, and the young man appreciated it. Twice they strolled round the garden, followed by Sandy, and Mrs. Granger, in a charming and playful way, made a chaperone of Sandy. "You know you're Sandy's friend," she said. "He discovered you." Mr. Anderson found this very touching. Then, when they had come round to the gate for the second time, she said that she would be very pleased to see if he would like to come in for a cup of tea that afternoon. "Thank you," he replied heartily. "That's very kind of you." And he really did think it was very kind of her, that she was a charming, gracious, kindly little lady. Yet he had not said definitely whether he would come to tea or not. For all the time in the back of his mind was a queer, miserable feeling he could not define, a sense of guilt, as if he had been very careless about something very dear to him. He thought that he would not make up his mind until he saw. What he saw was Miss Selby coming home from a walk with Mr. Quincy. She was carrying a small bouquet of violets, so he supposed that she had been in the woods, in those same woods, and with Mr. Quincy. So Mr. Anderson did go to tea with Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger said he might come on Wednesday evening, and he went. She played on the piano and sang for him, and he praised her music so much that she was charmingly confused. Never did she guess that it was not admiration that moved him, but pity, because she made so many mistakes in technique. And he accounted all these mistakes to her credit. He thought, like many another man, that the worse her performance in any art, the more domestic and womanly she must be. He felt a fine, chivalrous regard for the poor thing. But still he kept waiting for some sign of relenting on the part of Miss Selby. Every evening, as he crossed the dining room to the little table, he thought that perhaps tonight it would be different. Perhaps tonight it would be as it had been during that time when they talked to each other. Of course, if she didn't care, he wasn't going to force his unwelcome conversation upon her. She was a woman. It was her place to make the first move. What had he done, anyhow? Maybe he had been a little hasty, but at least he hadn't laughed at her, or even had the slightest desire to do such a thing. And if, in her unreasonable feminine way, she wanted him to apologize for things he hadn't done, he was ready to do so, if she would make the first move. Very well, thought Miss Selby every evening when she saw him. If he's satisfied to let things go on like this, I'm sure I don't care. She was much better able to wear a calm expression of not caring than he was. He looked dejected and sulky, but when out of the public eye he did better than she, for he merely walked up and down his room, or gazed out gloomily upon those depressing trees, while she, locked in her own room, often cried. The next Sunday it rained, but nevertheless he went out early in the afternoon, and Miss Selby knew very well where he was going. "Let him," she said to herself. "If he's so taken in by that designing woman and her dog, I don't care. She's probably trained the dog to behave like that." This was unjust. Mrs. Granger had no need to train dogs to bring guests into her house. Undoubtedly she liked Mr. Anderson, but if he had not come there would still have been Captain McGregor, whom she had been liking for a good many years. Mr. Anderson was soon made aware of the captain's existence by Leroy. Now, there is no denying that Leroy himself was a shock to the young man. To begin with, it seemed incredible that anyone who looked as young as Mrs. Granger should have a son 8 years old. And in the second place, if she did have a son, it should have been a different kind of child. Leroy was a nice enough boy in his way, but completely lacking in the plaintive and poetic charm of the mother. Indeed, he seemed more akin to Sandy, a rough, cheerful, headstrong young thing, but he had none of Sandy's admirable instinct for judging human nature, and in the beginning he did not like Mr. Anderson. He was frank about it. He said that Mr. Anderson's watch was markedly inferior to Captain McGregor's, and he expressed a belief that Captain McGregor could, if he wished, lick Mr. Anderson. He said a good many things of this sort, so that the young man was badly prejudiced against his unknown captain some time before he met him. And when he did meet him, on that rainy Sunday, nothing occurred to soften the prejudice. He found McGregor installed as an old friend. He found also that the man had brought to Mrs. Granger, as a gift, 6 silk umbrellas. 6! It was an overwhelming gift. Anderson himself had brought a box of chocolates, but this was completely overshadowed by the umbrellas, just as he himself was overshadowed by the impressive silence of the other man. A big, weather-beaten fellow of 45 or so was this McGregor, with the face and the manner of a giant sphinx. He was neither handsome nor entertaining, but it was impossible to ignore or despise him. The solid worth of him, the honest self-respect, and the massive obstinacy were plainly apparent. He was not worried by the appearance of a strange young man. On the contrary, he seemed mildly amused. He let Anderson do all the talking, and just sat in a corner of the veranda smoking his pipe. This aroused in Anderson an unworthy spirit of emulation. He did not enjoy being so completely overshadowed by this man and his 6 umbrellas, and he returned the very next evening with 4 superb phonograph records. He found McGregor there, just opening a paper parcel containing 14 pairs of white gloves. He waited until Wednesday, and then he arrived with a long box of the most costly roses. The captain was not there, but Mrs. Granger showed Anderson a little gift she had received from him the night before, 5 mahogany clocks. The unhappy young man was almost ready to give up then, until Mrs. McGregor casually explained that Captain McGregor was a marine insurance adjuster, and in the course of his business was often able to buy articles which had been part of damaged cargoes, and yet were themselves in no wise damaged. "So that he sometimes brings me the most wonderful things," she said. "He is so thoughtful and generous. Don't you like him, Mr. Anderson?" "Well, you see, I don't know him very well," Anderson replied. He went home somewhat comforted. Not only had Mrs. Granger been unusually sympathetic and charming, but her words had inspired him with a new idea. On Friday evening he arrived with a very large package, which he left in the hall. He then entered the sitting room and found Mrs. Granger sweetly admiring the captain's latest gift, 7 handsome black silk blouses, all exactly alike. He let her go on admiring, and even generously said himself that they were very nice. Then, after a decent interval, "By the way," he remarked, and went out into the hall and fetched his package. It was pretty imposing. He had spoken to the foreman of the paper mill, and the foreman had shown a friendly interest, so that he was now able to present to Mrs. Granger 1 ream of the finest cream vellum writing paper with envelopes, 2 reams of grey note paper with blue envelopes, 1 ream of thin white writing paper, the envelopes lined with dark purple, and a vast number of small memorandum pads, pink, blue, and yellow. "Those are for Leroy," he said, with a modest air which failed to conceal his triumph. This time he had won. There was no doubt about it. 6. On Saturday night, Miss Selby did not appear at the little table. Gone out to dinner, he thought. Why shouldn't she go out to dinner? He simply hoped that she was enjoying herself, and as he ate his solitary dinner he thought about this. He imagined Miss Selby enjoying herself somewhere, sitting at some other table, and probably with some other young man sitting opposite her. He knew how she would look if she were enjoying herself, with that lovely colour in her cheeks and that wonderful smile of hers. Well, it was none of his business, absolutely none of his business. And yet, after dinner, he found occasion to stop the landlady in the hall, and to say with an air of courteous indifference, "That young lady who sits at my table. Didn't see her tonight. Has she gone away?" "No, Mr. Anderson," answered Mrs. Brown with stern solemnity. "She has not. She's lying upstairs, sick at this very moment that I'm speaking to you. And I think it's pneumonia, that's what I think." "Pneumonia!" he cried. "But only last night." "It takes you sudden," Mrs. Brown asserted, And Miss Selby, well, people have often said to me how blooming she looks, but I knew it was nerve, and nerve alone that kept her going. Nerve strength, she sighed. It's a treacherous thing, Mr. Anderson. You live on your nerves, and then all of a sudden they snap, like that. And her bony fingers snapped loudly, a startling sound in the dimly lit hall. The young man was in no condition to judge of the value of Mrs. Brown's medical opinion. He was simply panic-stricken. He went out of the house in a sort of blind haste and began to walk along roads strange to him, under a cloudy and somber sky. He heard the voice of the wind in the trees, and to his unaccustomed ears it held no solace, but it was a voice infinitely mournful. Pneumonia, that little pretty thing, so far from home, ill and alone in a boarding house, such a young little thing. He remembered that morning in the woods, her face when she looked up at him from the violets she was picking, that radiant face, clear-eyed as a child's. "It's my fault," he cried aloud. "I ought to have known she couldn't take care of herself properly. It's my fault, the poor little thing. She's done some fool trick, got her feet wet, probably makes her lunch of an ice cream soda. Perhaps she can't afford any lunch, and now pneumonia. She had no right to get pneumonia. It's—" He stopped short in a still, dark little lane, clenched his hands, stood there shaken by pain, by anger, by all the unreason of grief and anxiety. "She ought to have known better," he shouted. 7. When he came downstairs the next morning, Mrs. Brown regarded his strained and haggard face with profound interest, and she observed to one of the old ladies that she believed Mr. Anderson was coming down with something. He made inquiries about Miss Selby's health, and obtained very vague and confused replies, which he interpreted as people jaded and despondent from a bad night are apt to interpret things. He went into the dining room, but he could eat no breakfast. Who could, sitting alone at a little table, opposite an empty chair? Then he went out again. It was a rainy day, but that was so fitting that he scarcely noticed it. He remembered having seen a greenhouse not far away, and he went there. It was not open on Sunday, but he made it be open. He banged so loud and so long on the door that at last an old man came out of a nearby cottage. "It's a case of pneumonia," said the young man fiercely. "I've got to have some flowers." So he was admitted to the greenhouse, and he bought everything there was, and then sat down at a little desk to write a card. He never forgot the writing of that card, the rain drumming down on the glass roof, the palms and rubber trees standing about him, and the hot, moist, steamy smell like a jungle. He never forgot what he wrote, or how he felt while he wrote it. But there would be no use in repeating what he wrote, for nobody ever read that card. He put it with the flowers and set off home. When he got there, he gave the bouquet, very sodden now, to Mrs. Brown's servant, and said to her, "Please give this to Miss Selby. Give it to yourself. Don't send it." Then he went up to his own room and locked the door. And the room was all filled with the grey light of a rainy day. The clang of the dinner bell startled him. He jumped up scowling and muttered, "Oh, shut up!" But just the same he had to obey it. He had to go downstairs and had to sit at the little table. Scarcely had he sat down when he saw Miss Selby enter the room. Miss Selby in a new dark green linen dress, looking unusually pretty and not even pale. He arose. He was pale enough. He couldn't speak. She must have received that card. She must have read it. As she glanced at him, he saw the color deepen in her cheeks, and her smile was uncertain. She was so lovely. "I thought," he began. She sat down, and he did too. Again their eyes met. "It's a miserable day," she observed. He didn't think so. He thought it was the most beautiful day that had ever dawned, and he might have said something of the sort, if he had not just at that moment seen an awful thing. He stared, appalled, almost unbelieving. The waitress was coming across the room carrying his immense bouquet. "No!" he cried, half rising. But it was too late. She had come. She presented the bouquet to Miss Selby with a pleased and kindly smile. "For you," she announced. Everyone in the room was watching with deep interest. "See here," said the young man in a low and unsteady voice. I only got them because I thought she told me you had pneumonia. I thought, give them back to her, throw them away. I'm sorry." "Sorry I haven't got pneumonia?" asked Miss Selby. "It's too bad, but perhaps I can manage it some other time." Her tone and her smile hurt him terribly. He wished that he could snatch the flowers away from her. She was laughing at him again. Everyone in the room was laughing at him. And it didn't occur to him that Miss Selby couldn't possibly know how he felt. but was a very young and inexperienced creature who was also hurt by his strange manner of giving bouquets. She thought he wanted her to know that, unless she were very ill, he wouldn't dream of giving her flowers. She was even more hurt than he was. "Will you bring a vase, please, Kate?" she asked. Kate did bring a vase, and the hateful and offensive flowers were set up between them like a hedge. He leaned over and with his penknife deliberately cut off the card tied to the stems and put it in his pocket. And not one more word did they speak all through that dreadful meal. 8. In his pain and anger and humiliation, he turned blindly to Mrs. Granger, the charming little lady who never laughed at anyone. He couldn't get to her fast enough. He strode on through the mud in the steady downpour of rain, simply longing to see her, to hear her soft, gracious voice, and to be within the shelter of her friendly home. The card was still in his pocket. He took it out and, as he walked along, tore it into bits and strewed them behind him. They fell into puddles where they would lie to be trampled on, those words he had written. A suitable end for them. He pushed open the gate of Mrs. Granger's garden, and was very much comforted by Sandy's ecstatic welcome. Dogs did know. They appreciated it when you meant well. They were not suspicious, not mocking. When you gave them something, they accepted it in good faith. He went on toward the house, walking rapidly, impatient to get there to the general serenity of Mrs. Granger's presence. He rang the bell, and directly the parlour-maid opened the door, he knew he was not going to have peace and solace. Something had gone wrong. He could hear Leroy's voice raised in a loud, forlorn bellow, and Mrs. Granger's voice tearful and trembling, and Captain McGregor's voice with a slightly exasperated note to it. He entered the sitting-room, and there was Mrs. Granger weeping and Leroy sobbing. Sandy began to bark. "Oh, Mr. Anderson," cried Mrs. Granger, "how can you let him do that? Oh, please keep him quiet." Anderson put the dog outside and then returned. "But what's the matter?" he asked. "Leroy's been bitten by a mad dog," cried Mrs. Granger. "Was not a mad dog," Leroy asserted. "See, here on his leg," she went on. "And he never told me. It happened late yesterday." "There's no reason to assume that the dog was mad," interrupted the captain. "It was. Animals adore Leroy. Only a rabid dog would dream of biting him." "It was not a rabid dog," Leroy insisted sullenly. "Well, see here," said Anderson. If you're worried, why not have his leg cauterized?" "Oh, I can't," she cried. "My child burned with red-hot irons." Leroy began to bellow at this inhuman suggestion, and Mrs. Granger clasped him in her arms. "Don't cry, darling," she sobbed. "Mother won't let them hurt you." And she looked at Captain McGregor and Mr. Anderson with unutterable reproach. They were silent for a time. "Well, see here," Anderson suggested. "If you could find the dog and keep it under observation for a few days." This idea appealed to the child. "Sure," he said. "I'll find him, Mum. You just let me alone and I'll find him for you, all right." "You said you couldn't remember what the dog looked like." "Yes, I know, but I remember the street where it was, and I'll go back there tomorrow," Leroy declared. "I could stay out of school just in the morning and just ferret it out. I got lots of clues, and I bet you—" "I'll go with you now," said Anderson. The agitated mother didn't even thank him. "Perhaps that would be a good idea," she admitted. "You might try it anyhow and see." So Leroy was fortified against the rain in oilskins and rubbers, and he and Mr. Anderson set forth together in quest of the dog. The small boy was highly pleased with the adventure. He did not often have an opportunity to frolic in the rain, and he made the most of it, caracoling before Anderson like a sportive colt. Sandy, too, would have enjoyed it, but he was tied up. "One dog at a time," said Anderson. "Now, young feller, let's hear about it." "Oh, it was nothing," Leroy replied with admirable nonchalance. "Just a dog ran up and bit me. I was running, and I guess I stepped on his paw, and he bit me." "Did you tell your mother you stepped on the dog?" "I don't know what all I told her," Leroy admitted. "Anyway, what's it matter? Had to do something to keep her quiet." Anderson considered that it was not his place to rebuke this child, and he let the disrespect pass. "Where did it happen?" "Long ways from here, all right," said the boy triumphantly. He spoke no more than the truth. It was a very long way. They went on and on, down long, quiet suburban streets, lined with dripping trees and houses with no signs of life. They went on and on. At first Leroy was talkative and cheerful, and found great satisfaction in splashing in puddles. But as time went on, he grew silent, and tramped through the puddles more as a matter of principle than through enjoyment. "What was the name of the street?" asked Anderson. "Well, I don't know," the boy answered. "But I guess I'd know it if I saw it. Somewheres around here it was. Might be around the next corner. They went round the corner and there was a candy store. That's it, Leroy announced. It's open, too. Mr. Anderson said nothing but walked steadily forward, and Leroy trotted by his side. They sure did have good lollipops in there, observed Leroy. Best I ever tasted. Still no response from the adult, possessor of all power and wealth. Leroy sighed, and Anderson turned to look at him, and discovered a wet and not very clean face upturned to his, with brown eyes very like Sandy's. Poor little kid, tramping along so bravely in his oilskins. He looked tired, too. All right, said Anderson. We'd better go back and get a few lollipops. After that, Leroy went on, much encouraged in spirit. Here's the street, he cried at last. The little dog ran out of one of those houses. I don't know which one. Mr. Anderson rang the bell of the first house. The occupants owned no dog, never had, and never intended so to do. In the second house he was confronted by a very disagreeable old lady. She admitted that she had a dog, and she said with unction that her dog could and would bite any persons unlawfully trespassing on her property, as was any dog's right. I dare say Rover did bite the boy, she suggested, if he came in here trampling and stampling all over my flower beds. And serve him right, I say. I did not, said Leroy indignantly. And that's not the dog, Mr. Anderson. I can see him out the window. He's a police dog, and my dog was a little one. They proceeded to the next house. Nobody came to the door at all. There was only one more house left on the street. Well, I hope the right dog's in there, said Leroy. But, he paused, then laid his hand on Anderson's sleeve. Most any little dog would do, he said, very low, for her. Mr. Anderson was about to protest sternly against such a dishonest and immoral suggestion. But somehow he didn't. The child's hand looked so very small, and his manner was so trusting. He said nothing at all, simply walked up the path to this last house. He rang the bell, and the door was opened with a startling suddenness by a little man with spectacles and a neatly pointed white beard. He looked like a professor, and he was a professor, of Romance languages, and because of his scholarly unworldliness, he had been cheated and swindled so many times that he had become fiercely suspicious. He glared. This boy has been bitten by a dog, Mr. Anderson explained, and we want to find the dog to see. Ha, said the little man. And what has this to do with me, pray? I thought perhaps you had a dog here. The professor folded his arms. Very well, said he. I have. And what of it? If you'll let us see the dog. Aha, said the professor. I see. A blackmailing scheme. You wish to see my dog. You will then cause this child to identify the dog as the one which bit him, in order that you may collect damages. A very pretty little scheme, I must admit. Anderson had had a singularly trying day, and he was very weary of this quest anyhow. Nothing of the sort, he said curtly. If you'll be good enough to let us see your dog, or if you'll give me your assurance that the animal is perfectly healthy. Don't you give him a penny, Joseph, cried a quavering female voice from the dark depths of the hall. The professor laughed ironically. Very pretty, he repeated. But you may as well understand once and for all that I absolutely refuse to allow you to see my dog, or to give you any assurance of any kind whatsoever. And nothing could move him. Mr. Anderson argued with him with as much tact and politeness as he could manage, just at that time, but in vain. See here, he said at last, let me see the dog, and if it's the right one, I'll buy it. Now will you believe? But the professor would not believe, until Anderson had signed a document which he drew up, solemnly promising that if the dog were identified by Leroy as the dog which had bitten him, he, Winchell Anderson, would purchase the said dog for the sum of $25. Then and then only was the dog brought into the room, and Leroy instantly, loudly, and fervently asserted that it was the dog. By this time Mr. Anderson was perfectly willing to believe him. He paid the money and stooped to pick up the dog, a small animal of what might be called the spaniel type. It snapped at him. He could not pick it up, because on the next attempt his hand was bitten. At last, upon his paying in advance for the telephone call, the professor summoned a taxi. Mr. Anderson could not get the dog into the taxi, but Leroy had no trouble at all with it. It seemed to like Leroy. They rode home in silence, because every time Anderson uttered a word, the animal growled and struggled in the boy's arms. They reached Mrs. Granger's house, and while Leroy ran ahead with the dog in his arms, Anderson delayed a minute to pay the taxi with the last bill remaining in his pockets. Then he followed. It had been a costly and a wearisome quest, but Mrs. Granger's relief and gratitude would be sufficient reward. In the doorway of the sitting room he paused a moment, smiling to himself at the scene before him. Leroy was down on his knees, playing with this quite unexpected and delightful new dog, and Mrs. Granger knelt beside him, one arm about her son's neck. Captain McGregor was there, but in a corner, so that one need not consider him in the picture. The peaceful lamplit room, the gentle mother and her child. "I'm very glad," he began, when, at the sound of his voice, the dog sprang up and rushed at him, and was caught by Leroy just in the nick of time. He growled threateningly. "I guess I'd better tie him up," said Leroy. "He doesn't like Mr. Anderson." "Why, how very strange," Mrs. Granger exclaimed. Leroy did tie him up to the leg of a table. "But why doesn't the poor little doggy like Mr. Anderson?" pursued Mrs. Granger, and there was something in her voice that dismayed the young man. "I don't know," he replied briefly. "It's very strange," she remarked. "Very. But sit down, Mr. Anderson. Perhaps you were just a little bit rough in handling him, without meaning to be." "No, he wasn't," Leroy asserted indignantly. At this point the dog broke loose, flew at Anderson, and would have bitten him if Anderson had not prevented him with his foot. "Oh!" cried Mrs. Granger. "Oh, Mr. Anderson, how could you? You kicked the poor little doggy." I simply pushed him with my foot," said Anderson. "He's a bad-tempered little brute." "Dogs are never bad-tempered unless they're badly treated," Mrs. Granger declared with severity. "They always know a friend from a foe." "All right," the young man agreed. "Then I'm afraid I'm a foe." He turned toward the door. "If you'll excuse me," he said, "I'll be getting along. I'm tired. Good evening." "Good evening," said Mrs. Granger and Captain McGregor in unison. She let him go. He opened the front door and stepped out into the rain again. And never in his life had he felt so bitter, so disappointed, so cruelly, intolerably depressed. After all he had done, she let him go like this. Not even a word of thanks. Poor little doggy, eh? Halfway down the path he heard a shout. It was Leroy, rushing after him bareheaded through the rain. "Say," he shouted, "you're—" Words failed him, and he stretched out his hand, a rough, warm little hand, wet from the rain, sticky from lollipops. Yet Anderson was very glad to clasp it tight. "Goodbye, old fellow," he said. "Goodbye, old fellow, yourself," answered Leroy. And he sat on the gatepost watching and waving his hand as Anderson went down the road in the rainy dusk. 9. Mr. Anderson had finished with women forever, and this resolve gave to his face a new and not unbecoming sternness. The old ladies noticed it directly he entered the dining room that evening. Miss Selby noticed it too, but pretended not to. She smiled that same chilly, polite smile and never said a word. Neither did he. Supper was set before them, and they began to eat, still silent. And then she spoke suddenly. "What's the matter with your hand, Mr. Anderson?" she asked. "Oh, nothing, thanks," he answered. Again a silence. But she could not keep her eyes off that clumsily tied bandage on his hand. "I wish you'd tell me," she said. It was an entirely different tone, but he was no longer to be trifled with like that. He smiled coldly. "No doubt you'll be very much amused," he remarked, "to learn that I've been bitten by a dog." He waited. "Why don't you laugh, Miss Selby?" he inquired. "It's funny enough, isn't it? After I said that dogs always know. It's what you might call biting irony, isn't it?" "I don't want to laugh," she said. "I'm just sorry." He looked at her. "Miss Selby!" he cried. "I took your flowers upstairs," she said. "I think they're the prettiest flowers I ever saw." "Miss Selby!" he exclaimed again. "See here, please. When I thought you were ill, I only had a little cold." "I wrote a note," he said. "I tore it up. I wish I hadn't." Miss Selby was looking down at her plate. "I wish you hadn't too," she agreed. The old ladies had all finished their suppers, but not one of them left the room. They were watching Miss Selby and Mr. Anderson. Surely not a remarkable spectacle, simply a nice-looking young man and a pretty young girl, sitting quite speechless now at a little table. Yet one old lady actually wiped tears from her eyes, and every one of them felt an odd and tender little stir at the heart, as if the perfume of very old memories had blown in at the opened window. "Let's go out on the veranda," said Mr. Anderson to Miss Selby, and they did. The rain was coming down steadily, and the wind sighed in the pines. But it was a June night, a summer night, a young night. Not an old lady set foot on the veranda that evening. Not another human being heard what Miss Selby from Boston and Mr. Anderson from New York had to say to each other. Only Mrs. Brown, opening the door for a breath of fresh air, did happen to hear him saying something about the best sort of paper for wedding announcements. End of Dogs Always Know. That's Not Love by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. That's Not Love. Serena Page's country place was a house of mirth, but merriment and tragedy are often close together. A gay world that summer morning. The sprinkler on the lawn flung a rainbow mist into the air and left tiny diamonds shining on the grass blades. Everything was astir. The leaves rustling on the trees, gay flowers swaying on their stalks. Curtains fluttered at the open windows, and through the cool, bright house voices came floating, light as butterflies. Serena Page had arisen. To be sure, she had told her house guests the night before that just because she had to get up was no reason why anyone else should be disturbed at the outrageous hour of 8:30. But somehow everybody was disturbed. Somehow her getting up made confusion all through the house, for that was Serena's special talent, to create an exciting sort of bustle about her, without herself doing anything at all. Serena! Never was a woman so misnamed. She came down the stairs, her filmy black negligee floating out behind her, so that she seemed, as always, to be coming in a breeze, an artificial breeze, though, perfumed and enervating, bringing no health or colour. She was without makeup at this early hour. Her handsome, haggard face was pale, her eyes were heavy. She entered the breakfast room, and there was the Moriarty girl, standing by the window. "Good morning, Mrs. Page," she said, with that enigmatic smile of hers. Serena smiled too, but faintly. Geraldine Moriarty was beginning to get on her nerves very badly, and she was longing for an excuse to fly into a rage with the girl. That was the only way Serena could get rid of people. She could do nothing in cold blood. She had taken on Geraldine in an outburst of generosity, and she would have to have an outburst of anger before she could send her away. "Had breakfast?" she inquired. "No, I was waiting for you, Mrs. Page." Serena took her place at the table, and the Japanese butler came forward to serve her. She did not know his name. She was not even sure that she had seen him before. She got her servants from an agency in the city, which upon demand would send her out a crew commanded by a butler. Sometimes things went wrong, and the whole lot left together, but another crew always came promptly, and her household suffered very little from the change. She had the art of making her home as impersonal as a hotel, but she did notice this butler. She smiled upon him, because his charmingly deferential air pleased her. He seemed to appreciate the solemnity of the occasion. It was indeed an important occasion. It was the beginning of Serena's diet. Before this elegant and luxurious creature, the butler set half a grapefruit, 2 slices of graham bread toast without butter, and a cup of black coffee. She shuddered a little and closed her eyes. Every morning henceforth, she was to get up at 8:30, go through a set of exercises, take a cold shower, and come downstairs to this. Everyone said she wouldn't be able to stand it. Those who pleased her best said she had absolutely no need of a reducing diet, and would be made ill by it. Only the Moriarty girl showed no interest at all. Serena observed that Geraldine had a slice of grilled Virginia ham on her plate. How Connie could ever have called her a sweet child, she thought. She's as hard as nails. Some 6 weeks ago, Connie Blanchard had come to Serena with the most piteous tale about Geraldine Moriarty. "Her mother and I went to the same school in Paris," she had said, "and now this sweet child's all alone in the world. Something awful happened to her father. He went bankrupt or lost his mind or something. I can't remember now. And Geraldine simply hasn't a penny. Fine old Irish family, you know, and she's awfully well educated. I'd love to help her, but you know how it is with me, my dear, living as I do in hotels, and I'm not strong. Do please do something for the poor child, Serena." Who could have done more? Serena had at once engaged Miss Moriarty as a secretary companion, and here she was, getting a nice little salary and with practically no work to do. The secretarial duties were almost non-existent, for Serena very seldom wrote or even answered a letter. She and her friends carried on their social activities by telephone, and they liked to do their own talking. As for the companion part, that was absurd. Serena was always surrounded by companions, and mighty obliging ones, too. Penniless cousins, ambitious and ambiguous ladies, all sorts of eager and pliant creatures who made up a little court where Serena ruled magnificently. No, all the Moriarty girl had to do was look on, and of course to admire, and it was at this simple task that she so utterly failed. She didn't seem to admire anything or anybody, not even herself. She was ironically indifferent to her own dark beauty. She had no decent clothes, and when Serena had offered her some very good things that she was tired of, Geraldine had refused, politely of course. She was always polite, always careful not to give Serena any excuse for getting rid of her. "But you'll go, my dear," thought Serena. "I've done quite enough for you." She glanced across the table at her silent companion. Hopeless, she reflected, simply hopeless. Of course, she's good-looking in a way, but she has absolutely no charm and no figure. Miss Moriarty went on eating with an excellent appetite. She was never talkative. She was quiet, but with a quiet which Serena did not find restful or soothing. She was a tall girl, thin and supple, with a careless grace in every movement. Her face had a gypsy darkness with high cheekbones, features delicate and yet bold, and black eyes with a scornful light in them. She was dressed in a black skirt, a black jersey, and a plain white blouse. A costume that made her look lanky, thought the dieting Serena, and she had that air of not caring. "For heaven's sake, do talk, my dear," cried Serena, overcome by exasperation. "I'm all on edge this morning, and it makes me horribly nervous to see you sitting there like a graven image." "I'll try," said Miss Moriarty obligingly. "Have you seen the delphiniums?" "Never heard of the thing," said Serena. "Oh, do answer that for me, my dear." For the butler had come forward to say that a gentleman wanted to speak to Mrs. Page on the telephone. There was inevitably a telephone in the breakfast room. There were telephones everywhere in that house, so that, in order to speak to a friend perhaps 100 miles away, one need not have the fatigue of walking more than 20 feet. Geraldine took up the receiver. "This is Mrs. Page's secretary," she said. "Will you give me the message, please?" "Tell Mrs. Page it's Sambo," said a curt and very clear masculine voice. "It's Sambo," repeated Miss Moriarty, turning towards Serena. She was surprised by the change that came over that haggard, petulant face. Forgotten were the nerves and the cruel diet. Serena sprang to her feet and ran to the telephone, and even her voice was changed. "Sambo!" she cried. "What an hour!" "Yes, I know, but why didn't you write me just once?" "I'm not reproaching you, silly boy. Only I did think you'd have time for just a line. No. Today, Sambo? But can't you give me some idea what time?" "Surely sometime today." "Oh, all right. Bye-bye, big boy." She came back to the table and sank into her chair, laughing. "I'll take a slice of that ham," she said to the butler, "and cream for my coffee. Quick, I'm starving." Then she looked at Geraldine. "Sammy Randall is coming," she announced. "How nice," said Geraldine. But Serena missed any irony there may have been in the words. Mrs. Anson had appeared in the doorway, and she called to her. "Betty, Sambo's coming out today." "My dear, how simply marvelous!" cried Betty Anson with fervor. Serena expected that fervor. She took it for granted that all her friends would rejoice with her. And so they did. Serena, the queen, was happy, and all her court was happy too, reaping the benefits of her good humor. "But that awful Moriarty," she whispered to Betty Anson. "She's worse than usual this morning. I don't know what's the matter with her. She's so indifferent and ungrateful." "Those people are always envious," said Mrs. Anson. "Governesses and companions, they're not exactly servants, you know. And yet they're not, well, they're simply out of everything." "I wish she'd stay out altogether," said Serena. Geraldine Moriarty wished the same thing. As she stepped out through the long window of the breakfast room to the lawn, she wished that she need never set foot in that house again. She hated it. She hated the life there, and at times she came dangerously close to hating the people in it. For, though Serena's conclusion that the girl was hard as nails was an exaggeration, there was a grain of truth in it. She had, for her 19 years, a character remarkably definite and independent. She had fortitude, courage, and the pride of Lucifer. She had come here penniless, solitary, and so young, direct from the almost cloistered life she had led with her invalid mother. And not for one instant had she been dazzled or swayed by the luxury and the feverish gaiety about her. She stayed because she knew no other way to earn her bread. But all her salary she put into a savings bank, and would not touch a penny of it. When there was enough, she meant to go away. She would learn typing and shorthand, find work in an office, and be done with this existence which she hated. She lived here in exile, utterly alien and lonely, among these people whom she neither comprehended nor pitied. Her people had been gentlefolk. She had been brought up in a tradition of dignity, honor, and reserve, and she clung to that tradition with all the strength of her loyal heart. What her people had been, she would be. Their ways were the right ways. Their manners, their speech, their tastes formed the standards by which all others should be judged. And so judged, Serena and her friends were damned. Geraldine saw no good in them at all. They were base, heartless, and vulgar. She walked across the lawn to the sea wall at the foot of the garden, and jumped down to the beach a few feet below. She wanted to be alone for a little while in the fresh, sweet summer morning, in the sun and the salt wind, and to forget the monstrous things she had seen. But she could not forget. In her anger and contempt, she was obliged to remember Serena's face at the mention of that man's name. Evidently, Serena loved this man with the mountebank name, and her friend seemed to think it a charming ideal, the love of a woman of 40, who had divorced one husband and was living in constant bickering with a second. The fact of her being married was simply a side issue. Faith and honor had no meaning at all for these people, and love, that was what they called love. 2. The summer day was drawing to a close. The shadows of the trees were long upon the grass. The sun was sinking through a sky wistful and delicate, faint rose and yellow. There was a blessed quiet all through the house. Serena and her friends had certainly intended to be back for tea, but they had not come. They never could do what they meant to do. Obstacles intervened, and they were not well equipped for dealing with obstacles. It took so little to stop them, to bar a road, to turn them off to a new destination. They had not come back, and Geraldine was having her tea alone in the library, reading a book as she sipped it. That was how Sambo first saw her, sitting very straight in a high-backed chair, with the last light of the sunset on her clear, pale face. He said later that she had put him in mind of a Madonna, and there were not many women he knew who could do that. He stood in the doorway staring at her for quite a long time. So long that he never afterward forgot how she looked then, so still, so lovely, so aloof. For a moment he was almost afraid to disturb her. But the fear of disturbing other persons had not yet greatly influenced young Samuel Randall. He was a conqueror, nonchalant and superb. He took whatever things pleased him in this world. Slender, almost slight with his fine features, his mournful dark eyes, he had a poetic and touching look about him. But it belied him. He was not poetic. He was greedy and willful and reckless. He wanted to talk to this lovely image, so in he went. "This a gentle hint?" he asked. Geraldine put down her book and looked at him. "I said I was coming today," he went on, "and they're all out. That mean I'm not wanted?" And he smiled his charming, arrogant smile, for he knew so well that he was always wanted. "Mrs. Page meant to be home by 5, said Geraldine, with no smile at all. "Something must have delayed her." "Then you'll give me a cup of tea, won't you? I'm Randall, you know." She said yes, none too cordially, and rang the bell for fresh tea. He sat down opposite her, slouching in his chair, his handsome head thrown back, his dark eyes watching her. "I'm Mrs. Page's secretary," she explained with cold formality. "Lucky, lucky Mrs. Page," said he. A faint color rose in her cheeks. She resented his attitude, his easy and careless manner, his appraising glance, and he read the resentment in her face. Prudish, he thought. This did not annoy him. He liked this tall, dark, unsmiling girl just as she was. A charming novelty, but he would have to change his tactics. "You were reading, weren't you?" he said respectfully. "I hope I didn't interrupt you." "No, Mr. Randall," she answered. Then suddenly his undisciplined soul was filled with a sort of envy for this untroubled and superior creature who read books. "I tried to read," he said. "I wish to heaven I could, but it's too late now." "I don't see how it could ever be too late to read," said Geraldine with a trace of scorn. He had straightened up in his chair. He was no longer staring at her, but at the unlighted cigarette that he was rolling between his fingers. "The thing is," he said, "I've been spoiled. People listen to me, any damn nonsense I spout, and I've got out of the way of listening to myself. Now, you see, when I take up a book that's worth reading, I feel as if the writer fellow had got me into a corner, and was trying to lay down the law, so I want to contradict him, and I chucked the blamed thing across the room." He spoke earnestly, and he was in earnest. It was his great charm that he was always sincere. He was not inventing things to say to this girl. He was simply selecting from his restless, curious mind those things which he thought would interest her. He was succeeding, too. He saw that. Geraldine did not speak, because to her reserved and proud spirit it was impossible to speak easily to a stranger. But she thought over his words with an odd sensation of distress. She felt sorry for the conquering Sambo. He had picked up her book and was turning the pages. It was a copy of The Hound of Heaven, which her father had given her long ago. Poetry, he said. Queer sort of stuff. Then he read aloud. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. He stopped, and for a moment he sat silent. The light was fading out of the sky now, and in the dusk his face looked white and strained. The echo of his strong voice seemed still to drift through the shadowy room. Looking at him, Geraldine had an extraordinary fancy, almost a vision of his terribly defiant soul fleeing, swift and laughing, to its own destruction. She was filled with an austere compassion and wonder. It was as if, in an instant, and without a word spoken, he had told her all the long tales of his wasted years. Sometimes, he said, the prey gets away from him. No, said Geraldine steadily. No, never. He struck a match, and by the flame that sprang out, vivid in the grey dusk, she had a glimpse of his face, with eyes half closed, proud and sorrowful, and he was changed in her sight forever. She saw him, not as a puppet in a shameful drama, but as a fellow creature with a soul. You know, he said, I've got lost. The match went out, and the room seemed very dark now. Geraldine wanted to speak, to tell him something, but she could not remember afterward what incredible words had come to her mind. They were never to be spoken, however, for just at that moment Serena came home. 3. In her first generous enthusiasm, Serena had declared that the sweet child must dine with them, no matter who was there, and now neither she nor Geraldine could find a plausible reason for altering the arrangement which had grown so irksome. This evening, as usual, Geraldine went upstairs to put on her one and only dinner dress. But she was not so reluctant as usual, nor so disdainful. She felt that she was no longer utterly alone. This man who had come to the house was different from the others. She remembered his face as she had seen it in the flare of the match, and remembered the sound of his voice. If he was lost, it was because he had been misguided. He was somehow a victim. Nobody noticed Miss Moriarty when she came to the table, for they were all very well used to her and her one evening gown. That is, nobody but Sambo. And to him she was new and lovely and profoundly interesting. He thought that her slender hands were beautiful. So was the sweep of her shining black hair away from her temples, and so was the proud arch of her brows. And he thought that her poor little black dress and her youth and her disdainful air were beyond measure touching. But he prudently kept his interest in Miss Moriarty to himself, and behaved as he was expected to behave. The diet was postponed, and Serena had asked the butler to see that there was an awfully good dinner. He had justified her blind faith in him, for the dinner was an excellent one. From the well-stocked cellar he had selected the proper wines, but nobody cared for these. They all preferred whiskey. Throughout the meal they drank whiskey and smoked cigarettes, and their talk was in keeping with this. It's not my business, thought Geraldine. I can't change the world. I'm just here to earn a living. But the contempt and indifference which until now had been her armor failed her tonight. She was troubled and very unhappy. None of these people were mere puppets any longer. They had come alive, and they were pitiful and a little horrible. There was the girl they called Jinky, tall and gaunt, with a sort of wasted beauty in her face. A year ago she had eloped with a very young millionaire, and, as he was under age, his parents had had the marriage annulled, wiped out, so that Jinky had come back from her wedding trip discredited and shamed before all her world. She didn't seem to care. She seemed hilariously amused by the whispered conversation of Levering, who sat next to her. But tonight Geraldine felt sure that Jinky did care, that the wound had left a cruel scar. There was Levering himself, with his supercilious high-bred face. He had married for money and hadn't got the money. It was a notorious joke in that circle that his middle-aged wife begrudged him every penny. He'd suffered his ignoble humiliation, and his wife suffered too, because of her jealous and bitter infatuation for him. There was the chic and lively little Mrs. Anson, with her eternal scheming for invitations and other benefits. There was her husband, grey-haired, distinguished in appearance, a slave to her ambition and his own weakness. There was Serena, magnificent in her dinings, talking only to Sambo, looking only at Sambo. There was Sambo himself, the man who had said he was lost. He listened to Serena carelessly and smiled, even when her face was anxious and frowning. He smoked incessantly. The light ashes from his cigarettes fell upon his plate, into his glass, and he swallowed them. as if he neither knew nor cared what was barren ash and what life-giving food. "Now what?" cried Serena, jumping up. "Bridge, or dancing, or what?" Geraldine had risen too, and she fancied that she heard Mr. Anson standing beside her mutter, "The deluge." He was unsteady on his feet, and his weary face was a curious grey. Geraldine had seen him like this before. He was trying to play, trying to be one of them, to forget, and he never could. "Oh, dancing, of course," said Jinky. They all went into the drawing-room, and one of the servants started the phonograph playing. The music began, the thud of drums like bare feet stamping, the sweet whine of Hawaiian guitars like lazy laughter. Geraldine had followed the others, meaning only to pass through on her way to the garden. But halfway across the room, Sambo stopped her. "Give me this dance," he said softly. "No," she answered with a quick frown, and moved away. But he came after her and laid his hand on her shoulder. "Please," he said, "why won't you?" The touch of his hand filled her with a great anger. She turned her head and looked at him with scornful amazement, and found in his face only laughter and cajolery. "Please," he said again, "just one dance." "No," she said. He could not very well misunderstand, or pretend to misunderstand, her tone. He dropped his hand and stood back. "Sorry," he said. She knew that he wasn't sorry. She went past him, threading her way among the dancing couples, and went upstairs to her own room. She locked the door and stood leaning against it in the dark, breathing a little fast from her haste and anger. She hated him. Vivid before her was the image of his handsome face, flushed with drinking, and of his conqueror's smile. Intolerable was the memory of his hand upon her shoulder. She hated him, and she could almost hate herself, because even for a minute she had thought he was different. 4. The next morning, when Geraldine came downstairs, the house was like an enchanted castle. The sun was streaming in, for it was full day, yet all the rooms were silent and deserted. The little Japanese men had done their work like brownies, and were now invisible, and all the people who had danced the night before were lost in sleep. She went into the breakfast room and rang, and the butler came hurrying in, smiling cheerfully. She told him what she wanted to eat, and crossed to the windows for a breath of sweet air and a glimpse of the garden in its morning beauty. The first thing she saw was Sam Randall, on the terrace, smoking a cigarette. Her first impulse was to run away. He was down at the other end, and he had not seen her yet, but she checked herself with a sort of severity. Why should she run away from him? What had she to do with him, or with any of the people in this house? She had judged and condemned them long ago. It was only through a moment's weakness that she had been betrayed into taking an interest in this man. The weakness was mastered now, and the interest had turned to scorn. He was just like the others, perhaps a little worse. She heard his leisurely footsteps on the flags outside. She heard him come in through the long window. She knew that he was standing beside her, but she paid no heed until he spoke. "Good morning," he said. Then she looked straight into his face. "Good morning," she answered evenly. She was sorry then that she had looked at him, for there was no laughter or arrogance about him now. He seemed subdued and anxious, younger than she remembered, and somehow appealing. "Look here," he said, "I didn't mean to offend you last night. I don't quite see why, but anyhow, I'm sorry." Her breakfast was on the table, and she sat down before it. It occurred to her that her silence was ungracious and unkind, but she knew no way to break it. For all her self-reliance, she was very young and very inexperienced. She could not mask her resentment. She could only hold her tongue. Sambo sat down opposite her. She was determined not to raise her eyes. But without doing so, she could see his slender brown hands extended across the table, and the cuffs of his soft blue shirt. She also saw that he was holding a little field daisy. Surely there was nothing in that to touch her heart. Yet it did, and the pity that she felt for a passing instant increased her anger. An obstinate and forbidding look came over her face. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Look here, do you mind if I sit here with you?" "It's not for me to dictate Mrs. Page's guests." "You can dictate to me all you want," said he. "Nothing I'd like better." Again she was conscious that she was behaving ill, and again it strengthened her obstinacy. "I'll go away if you like," he went on. "But the way you talked to me yesterday, I've been thinking so much about it. Please tell me what I've done, what has made you change." "I haven't changed," she answered coldly. He leaned nearer to her. "Look here," he said entreatingly, "don't treat me like this. Don't shut me out. I came down early, just on the chance of seeing you. The others will be down presently, so I only have this little minute. Let me talk to you. You're so wonderful. No one like you in the world, you and your poetry and your lovely quiet face. Don't send me away, dear girl." She sprang to her feet. You have no right, she cried. He, too, had risen. I'm sorry, he said. You wouldn't mind if you knew how I felt about you. I'm at your feet. You, she began, but her voice was so uncertain that she could not go on. I'm at your feet, he repeated quietly. If you want to treat me like this, I can't help it. It won't make any difference. I'll always... Hush, she said. The servants will hear you. Let 'em, said he. I'll bet they've heard worse than that. Without another word, he walked away through the window out to the terrace again. Geraldine tried to go on with her breakfast, but a strange confusion and pain filled her. She told herself that this was only an episode of no significance. Randall would go away soon, and she need never see him or think of him again. What he had said to her he said, very likely, to every woman he met. He had come here to see Serena. He belonged to Serena. He was one of that circle, one of those people, without heart, without honor, without decency. At her feet. Geraldine remembered his hand on her shoulder, his laughter in the face of her just anger. It was a lie. He had no more respect for her than he had for these other women. He thought she was like them, and would be flattered by a smile from him. She hated him. She had a fine opportunity to test his alleged humility that very day. By noon, the rest of the household had come downstairs, languid and heavy-eyed, and all in need of bracers, but not Sambo. He was not jaded or depressed. He laughed at the others. It seemed to Geraldine that wherever she went, she could hear the sound of his debonair laughter. He was easily the leader among them. No longer was Serena their queen. It was Sambo who reigned supreme, not only because she had exalted him, but because of his quick wit, his audacity, his graceless and irresistible charm. They sat about half dead until lunchtime. After lunch they were revived enough to begin considering what to do with the afternoon. Serena wanted to visit some friends. Mrs. Anson wanted to play bridge. Levering wanted to go out on the yacht, but Sambo said they would go to the country club, and he had his way. Everyone went upstairs to dress except Geraldine. She wasn't expected to come. Nobody thought about her at all. Sambo had not spoken one word to her, had scarcely glanced at her. When they were alone, he called her wonderful, but when the others were there, he ignored her as they did. 5. Geraldine was in her room dressing for dinner when they returned. The house was suddenly in confusion. Electric bells rang, and she heard their voices in an excited babble. They came in like a party of raiders taking possession of an abandoned stronghold. I can't stand it much longer, thought Geraldine. I'm getting nervous and irritable. I ought to go, only she had nowhere to go, nowhere in all the world. Strangers were living in her old house. She wondered how it looked now. There used to be an air of peace about it at this hour of a summer day, when the tangled garden had grown dim and the old house full of shadows. She and her mother used to sit by the open window in the dusk, not talking very much, but so happy. Even old Nora in the kitchen was blessed by that peace, and would croon contentedly as she moved about. All gone now. Geraldine had been a young girl then, like a child in the safe shelter of her mother's love. Only a little while ago, but she would not think of that. She would not shed a single tear. Her mother had been so brave, even when her father was ruined and heartbroken by his failure in business. For that was the something dreadful that had happened to him. Even when he died, her mother had been so brave and always so quiet. That was the right way, and the way that Geraldine would follow. If her forlorn young heart grew faint in her exile, she would look back just for a glance and would remember just for an instant, and would be comforted and strengthened. She put on her black dress, gave an indifferent glance in the mirror, and opened the door. And there in the hall was Sambo, waiting for her. "Look here," he said, "I want to know. I've simply got to know. What's the matter?" "Nothing," she replied. She tried to pass, but he barred the way. "No," he said, "I'm going away tomorrow morning, and I've got to know. Have I offended you or done anything you don't like? The first time I saw you yesterday afternoon, what has made you change?" She did not answer, but her averted face was eloquent enough. "Look here," he said, "if I thought it was simply that you disliked me—" He paused for a moment. "But I don't think that," he went on. "You did like me at first. I've been thinking, is it on account of Mrs. Page?" "What?" she cried, appalled. "Because you know," she noticed that he glanced up and down the softly lit hall before he continued, "if it's that, I give you my word there's nothing in it. Absolutely nothing. I've never even pretended to her." "Do you think I'm going to discuss that with you?" she said, looking at him with a sort of horror. "There's nothing to discuss," he answered. "I wanted you to know that, but then—" "Please let me pass," she said. "I don't want to talk to you." He did not move. He stood squarely before her with a queer, dogged, miserable look on his face. "Not until you tell me why you hate me," he said. She was silent for a moment, her heart filled with almost intolerable bitterness. Then suddenly she laughed. "Oh, but you'd really better go," she said. "You wouldn't like it if someone should come and find you speaking to me." She regretted the words as soon as they were spoken. A singular change came over him. "You mean," he began and paused, "you think I'm ashamed to be seen talking to you?" "Let me go," she said vehemently. "I won't listen." But her defiance was little more than bravado. Her knees felt weak. She was frightened by the inexplicable thing she had done. "That was a beastly, unjust thing to think," he went on. "It was only on your account. I thought you wouldn't want anyone to know." "No, no what?" she interrupted, with an attempt at her former scornfulness. But in her heart she was dismayed and terribly uneasy. "All right," he said. "You think I'm ashamed. By heaven, you'll see. I'm proud of it. It's the finest thing I ever did in my life, to love you." "Oh, stop," she whispered. "No, I'd like everyone in the whole world to know it. I'm proud of it. I told you I was at your feet, and I meant it. Oh, please," she said. He stopped, looking at her as if stricken dumb by some unbearable revelation. All that was hard and proud had vanished from her face, leaving a tragic and exquisite loveliness. She stood there in her distress like a lost princess, bewildered and solitary, but unassailable in her mystic innocence. "Look here," he said, His voice was so unsteady that he could not go on for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't realize how young you are. If you'll forgive me." She shook her head mutely. He waited in vain for a word, but none came. Then he turned and walked away, and she went back into her own room and locked the door. She too had not realized how young she was, how untried her strength. This overwhelmed her. She was so miserable, so shaken, that now at last the tears came in a wild storm. Her pride was mortally wounded. It was a disgrace to her that Sam Randall should think of her like that. It was cruel, horrible, unforgettable that the first words of love she had ever heard from a man should be his words. His talk of love was a mockery, an insult. Yet the memory of his set face and his unsteady voice called her a strange pang that was not anger. "I can't understand," she cried to herself. "I can't understand." And it was the first time in her life that Geraldine, with her rigid code, her intolerant and sharply defined opinions, had ever thought that. 6. Jessie Page ordered the car stopped at the entrance to the driveway and went the rest of the way on foot. The stars were out in the bland summer sky, and amid the dark trees stirred by no wind, the house with its lighted windows had a gay and delicate beauty, an air of festival. Down by the sea wall the little yacht was moored, swinging gently, throwing into the black water 2 little quivering pools of red and green. But there was not a sound from the house or garden. "Not even a dog to bark when I come home," he thought, with a faint, bitter smile. Heaven knows he had made this solitude for himself. He was a man who found it easy to win affection, so easy that he distrusted what cost him so little effort. He could believe in nothing and no one, himself least of all. He walked on the grass so that his footsteps made no sound. He was a stalwart man, tall and of soldierly bearing, with a handsome, heavy face and dark hair a little gray on the temples. He was a domineering, headstrong, passionate man, and terribly unhappy. He wanted to be angry, but it was unhappiness that filled him, a queer, pathetic sort of bewilderment. "By God, it's not fair! It's not fair!" he said to himself over and over again. That was the way he saw it. It was not fair that he should be hurt like this. He never once looked for a cause, for any fault in himself, or for any general rule to apply. It simply was not fair that this should happen to him. He had been away in Chicago, looking after some business affairs, making more money, for her to spend, of course. And then this letter came. What if it was anonymous? What if it was written with savage malice? He had a pretty fair idea as to who had written it and why. Serena had enemies. He had listened to innuendo before, and now he was going to know. The front of the house was deserted, and he went round to the side, where the dining room was. Just as he turned the corner, he saw someone come out through one of the French windows. He stopped and drew back into the shadow of the wall. It was a man, and he fancied he recognized that slender and vigorous figure. He waited and watched. The other man stopped to light a cigarette, but his back was towards the house. Then he strolled leisurely toward the garage. Page followed him a little way, but when the other entered the brightly lit building, he was satisfied. It was young Randall. That was all he needed to know. He went back to the front of the house and entered there. It was his own house, but the servants and new crew did not know him. The butler tried to stop him, but he pushed the anxious little man aside and proceeded to the dining room. They were there, the whole crowd of them, sitting about the disordered table, jaded and hot and full of a restless languor. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. A little blue-eyed man with a grey mustache was performing an elaborate conjuring trick with matchsticks and somebody's gold watch. And Serena lay back in her chair looking at him with a distant smile. Her haggard face was flushed, her eyes heavy. Jesse Page thought he had never seen her more beautiful or more hateful. By God, it's not fair, he thought again. I've given her everything. I've put up with all her whims, and now I could kill her. It was as if his thought had sped through the room like an arrow. Serena straightened up in her chair, turned her head, and saw him standing in the doorway. "Jesse!" she cried. He did not speak or move. He stood there, his straw hat pushed back, staring at her with narrowed eyes. "Jesse!" she said again. She half rose from her chair, her own eyes dilated and fixed upon him. Then someone near her stirred, and the sound recalled her to her surroundings. Here was the stage upon which she was accustomed to play a leading part, and everyone was looking at her. She sank back into the chair again with a laugh. "You beast," she said. "You startled me so. Why didn't you tell me you were coming home, Jesse? Have you had your dinner?" He gave his hat to a servant and sat down in the one chair that was vacant. Now he had found out. Now he knew. Startled her, had he? That was guilty terror he had seen in her face. Let her sit there smiling, radiant in her jewels at the head of her own table. She was frightened. She couldn't take her eyes off her husband. "Hello, everybody," he said genially. "Don't let me spoil the party. Come on now. I'll have another drink, eh?" The response he got made him feel physically sick. God, what people, he thought. They're all afraid of me. Afraid of a row. He looked around the table at the eagerly smiling faces and smiled himself. A broad grin. "One missing, isn't there?" he asked. "Who was sitting in this place?" There was a moment's silence. "Oh, there," said Serena. "Miss Moriarty. She's gone upstairs with a bad headache." "I see," said Page, still grinning. "I suppose I really ought to go up and see how the poor girl's getting on," continued Serena. "Oh, no," he said suavely. "Don't go. Wait a bit and perhaps she'll come back." There was another silence. "We don't want to sit here," cried Betty Anson nervously, pushing back her chair. "Let's go." "I like to sit here," said Page. He poured himself another whiskey and lit a cigarette. "I think I'll have a demitasse and a sandwich. You people must keep me company. Don't go, Betty." She settled back again. She was sorry for Serena, but it would never do to offend Jessie. If there's any serious trouble, she thought, poor Serena will be done for. The ambitious Mrs. Anson couldn't afford to take up the cause of people who were done for. She glanced covertly across the table. Her husband sat with his eyes fixed on the cloth, his distinguished grey head bent. Levering was grave, but the shadow of a smile hovered around his lips. Jinky sitting next to him. What was the matter with Jinky? How queer she looks, thought Mrs. Anson. She was really distressed by the look on Jinky's wasted young face. For of all the people there, Jinky could least afford any indiscreet pity. Jesse Page was a distant cousin of hers. He had been generous to her, and she needed it. No, she really shouldn't look at Serena like that. Suddenly Jinky jumped up and without a word walked across the room to the window and out on the terrace. "Jinky," Page called sharply, "where are you going?" She turned her head and glanced at him, but she did not answer. For a moment she stood there in the bright light, a curiously dramatic figure in her emerald dress, with her gleaming black hair and her white thin face. Then she put her jade cigarette holder between her teeth and went off over the lawn. Page jumped up and followed her. "See here, Jinky," he said furiously, "you'd better—" "See here, Jessie," she interrupted, "you're making a fool of yourself." "All right, perhaps I enjoy it." "It'll take," said Jinky deliberately, "just about 5 minutes for you to make such a mess of things that you'll regret it all the rest of your days, Jessie." "Oh, no," he said with a grin. "It'll take a good deal less than 5 minutes when I catch sight of that lad." Jinky stopped. From where she stood she could look into the garage, and she was satisfied. "Go ahead," she said. "I'll drop out." As she turned back toward the house, he went with her. "Somehow," he said, "I feel that where Jinky goes, there must I go too." "Keep it up, Jessie," she said. "You'll deserve what you'll get." They found the dining room deserted, with an air of haste and disorder about it. A cigarette smouldered in a saucer, a cup of coffee had been overturned, and a dark stain was still spreading slowly over the lace cloth. Page went into the drawing room, and Jinky followed. Serena was not there. He went toward the door again, hesitated, and came back. Jinky had vanished now, through the card room. "All right," he said. "Let them have a little more rope." 7. Jinky met Serena coming down the stairs. There had been no love lost between these two. They had never been friends, and Serena, with the memory of more than one petty blow dealt to Jinky, expected no mercy from her now. She was about to pass with a vague, strained smile when the girl stopped her. "You'll have to try another line, Serena," she said. "No use pretending that Sambo wasn't here." "Oh, let me alone," cried Serena desperately. "Don't I know that?" "Well, look here," said Jinky thoughtfully. "Where is he, anyhow?" "Down on the shore road waiting for me. We were going to run over to the Abercrombies in his car. If I don't show up, he'll come back here and they'll telephone. Oh, Jinky, Hold up a minute, let's see. No use in my going. Jessie would tag along. But the Moriarty girl could go." "Moriarty?" cried Serena. "You're simply insane, Jinky. Why, she's the most—" "I think she's a pretty decent sort of kid. Anyhow, I'll try." "But Jinky, she's ill. Didn't come down to dinner. She sent me word that she had an awful headache. There's no use wasting time over her." "I'll have a try at it," persisted Jinky. "Jinky," said Serena with fervor, "you're a simply wonderful pal to me. I'll never forget this. Never." "I hope you won't," replied Jinky. She went on up the stairs and knocked on the Moriarty girl's door. "Who is it?" asked a cold voice. "Let me in. I want to speak to you." The door was opened. Jinky went in and closed the door after her. "Yes," said Geraldine. But Jinky did not answer for a moment. She was looking at Geraldine, studying her with all her hard-won wisdom. A child, she thought her. A lovely child, with her heavy hair in a braid, and her outgrown bathrobe, but a child half awakened to reality. "Look here," she said briefly. "Do you want a chance to do a decent thing?" What is it?" "I'll tell you," said Jinky. "If you want to help, you can get dressed and run down to the shore road and meet Sam Randall." "No," cried Geraldine, "I won't. I won't have anything to do with that." "You needn't think it's a grand operatic tragedy," said Jinky. "Serena and Sam aren't exactly Tristan and Isolde. There's nothing very wicked in their little flirtation. But Jessie Page just came home in a pretty poisonous temper, and if Sambo comes back to the house now, there'll be trouble. I don't care." "I suppose you don't know what you're talking about," said Jinky. "I hope you don't. If you understood that you could stop a nasty scandal, and perhaps something even worse, and you just wouldn't do it and didn't care." She paused. "It's serious," she went on. "Jessie means business. You can help these people if you want to. If you don't want to, all right. It's up to you." This was the first time Geraldine had had a problem presented to her in such a way. There was no question of right or wrong. Evidently Jinky thought it didn't matter whether these people deserved to be helped or not. She simply offered the girl a chance to do a decent thing. Geraldine looked at Jinky and found Jinky looking at her. And Savonarola never preached a more eloquent sermon than Jinky did by her silence. She stood there smoking her cigarette, a haggard, reckless, wasted young creature, just waiting to see if the other girl was willing to help. It was up to Geraldine. "I'll go," she said. "Moriarty," cried Jinky, "you're a little gentleman. Hurry up now, I'll help you." Geraldine needed assistance. Her hands were so unsteady that she was glad to let Jinky pin up her hair and hook her belt. "Now step," said Jinky, "and see here, Moriarty. Better let Sambo run you down to the Abercrombies and tell them not to telephone here. See Oliver Abercrombie yourself. She's got it down on Sambo. Tell her not to say anything about anything. She'll understand." Geraldine put on her hat and took up a scarf. A funny old-fashioned knitted scarf that made Jinky smile. She could never afterward think of that evening without remembering the old scarf. 8. Sambo sat in his car smoking and contemplating the starry sky. He was very unhappy, very much troubled, and so intent upon his own affairs that Serena's lateness had caused him no concern whatever. Indeed, when he thought of her at all, it was to wish that she would never come. He wished that he could start up his car and drive off somewhere, into another world. Yet the world he was in was beautiful tonight. His car was drawn up beside a coppice of pine trees, brave, tall trees standing black against the sky, which was filled with the mild light of the stars. Behind him lay the sea. He could hear it breaking quietly on the sand, and the salt savor of it was in the air, with the aromatic fragrance of the pines. A beautiful world, and he was young and vigorous, and his pockets were well filled. And still he was saying to himself, "I'm so sick of the whole show, so blamed sick of the whole thing." His quick ear caught the sound of footsteps hurrying along the road. He sighed, sat up a little straighter, and waited, with a resigned and somber expression upon his face. Now he realized that Serena was very late, and he thought he would be justified in being rather disagreeable about it. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to go to the Abercrombies. He was mortally weary of all this. The hurried steps drew nearer, and now he could dimly see an approaching figure. Serena never walked like that, never came light and swift, tall and free-moving as a young Diana. It looked like... but of course it couldn't be. It seemed so only because he had been thinking so much of that other girl and longing so much to see her. He turned up the headlights of his car, sending a clear river of light along the road, and the hastening figure was plain to him now. It was Geraldine. He sprang out of the car and went to meet her, his dark face all alight. "Dear girl," he cried, "why, I couldn't believe—" She drew back a little. "No," she cried, "I only came—" "I don't care why you came," he began. "You're here. That's enough." Then he noticed how anxious she was, how hurried and how pale. The light died out of his face. He became grave, as she was. "Anything wrong?" he asked. His voice was gentle, and he stood before her with a sort of humility. He knew now that she had not come on his account, and he was terribly disappointed. She saw that, yet she felt that, after all, it would not be hard to explain to him, to ask anything of him. She felt sure that he would understand and would do whatever she wanted, and that knowledge caused her an odd little thrill, half of pain, half of pride. "Mr. Randall," she said, "Mr. Page has come home, and—" She stopped, and he saw a change come across her face, that cold and scornful look again. When she had put this thing into words, the shamefulness and the ugliness of it were not to be disguised. "So they sent me," she went on curtly, "to say that you had better not come back now." "I see," said Randall. "I'm to run away when Jessie comes? Well, I won't." She had not expected this. "But don't you see," she said vehemently. "You'll have to, on Mrs. Page's account." "I won't," he declared again. They were both silent for a moment. "Look here," he said abruptly. "How did you get mixed up in this? Why did you come?" "Because I wanted to help," she answered, as if the words were hard to speak. Again there was silence. "All right," he said at last. "I'll do whatever you say." She looked away as she answered. "Miss Chinky is the only name I know her by. She thought I'd better go and speak to Mrs. Abercrombie." "All right. Do you want me to run you down there now?" "Yes, please." He opened the door of the car, but made no effort to help her in. Then, when she was seated, he got in beside her. "Miss Moriarty," he said, "look here. Will you marry me?" She was too much astounded to utter a word. She sat staring at him. "You needn't bother to answer," he went on, without even turning his head toward her. "I know you won't. I just wanted you to know that that was how I felt about you. Now you understand, anyhow." He started the engine, and the little car shot off smoothly along the road, under the shadow of trees, out into the open country, past wide and quiet fields, past little lighted houses. They went at a terrific speed. Geraldine closed her eyes, dazed by the rush of wind against her face, the steady hum of the engine, and the dark landscape that seemed to be streaming past her like a figured scarf. Randall did not speak again, yet she could almost believe that his wild haste was the very voice of his reckless spirit. It was as if she were listening to him all the time, as if he were telling her again that he was lost, that he didn't know where he was going and didn't care. And a very passion of regret and pity seized upon her. She did not judge him now or remember his misdeeds. She could not see him. But she knew so well how he looked, so young, so gallant, so debonair, and so pitiful. She was not frightened. She was sorrowfully resigned to go with him, rushing through the dark, whatever their destination. Suddenly the car slowed down. Geraldine opened her eyes, faintly surprised to find the world so quiet again. "Need gas," he explained. He stopped before a little gasoline station, theatrically brilliant against the dark trees. He jumped out, lifted the hood, looked in at the engine, was satisfied, and, closing the hood, turned to speak to the man who had come out of the station. The thing that followed was utterly unreal. Geraldine saw him standing there, bareheaded in his dinner jacket, in that brilliant light like an actor on a stage. He had just lit a cigarette and was smiling at something the garage man said, when another car came by and stopped with grating brakes. A voice shouted something and a shot rang out. Before the girl could believe that it had happened, the other car had gone on, and Randall and the garage man stood there motionless, white, as if listening intently to the shot that still echoed in the air. "Get his number," the man bawled suddenly. She saw Randall put his hand into his pocket and bring out a roll of bills. She could not hear what he said, but it was a short enough speech. The man thrust the money into his own pocket and ran to connect the hose. Randall climbed back into the car. "That's enough," he said. In a minute they were off again. They went around the drive before the station, turned homeward. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," he said curtly. Then, in a moment, "I suppose you've got to know." It was Paige, trying a little melodrama. "No harm done, but I wish to God you hadn't gotten mixed up in it. I'm going to get you home as fast as I can. Just keep quiet about the whole thing, won't you? Don't—" He stopped abruptly, and the car swerved to one side. He muttered something under his breath and went on steadily again. But suspicion began to draw upon her. "Mr. Randall," she cried, "are you hurt?" "No," he replied with a laugh, a strange laugh. "Only—" "Mr. Randall," she said, "I'm sure. Oh, please stop the car. I know you're hurt." "Would you care if I were?" "Yes," she cried. "Yes, I would care. Oh, please don't go on. Stop the car and let me see." But he went on along the smooth, empty road, not driving fast now, but very, very carefully. "It would be worth a bullet through the head," he said, "to hear you speak like that. But I'm not hurt. I'm not—" His labored voice almost broke her heart. "Sambo," she cried, "please, please let me see. Stop! Stop!" He did stop then. He put his arm about her and drew her close to him. "My little darling," he said, "my little blessed angel. For you to care like this." She let her head rest against his shoulder. She let him kiss her pale, cold cheek. Then she began to sob. "Tell me," she pleaded. "I'm not hurt," he said gently. "Nothing for you to cry about, little sweetheart. Only, don't you see, you've got to get home quick, before he does. If you'll go quietly to your room and say nothing, there'll be no harm done. Come now." He took his arm from her shoulder and started the engine. He went still faster now. She spoke, but he did not answer. His eyes were intent upon the road before him. He stopped at the foot of Serena's garden. "Now stroll up to the house as if you've been taking a walk," he said. "No, I won't. I can't. I'm afraid you're hurt." "Look," he said, "there's just one thing on earth you can do for me, and that is to clear out. There's nothing that could be so bad as your getting mixed up in this. I mean it. Don't make it hard. Just go." She could not withstand his broken and anxious voice. She obeyed as a child obeys, leaden-hearted, in tears, only half comprehending, going simply because he entreated her to go. She opened the door of the car and got down into the road, but her scarf had caught in something. She pulled at it, jerked it upward, and it still held fast. "Oh, go on," he cried as if in anger. "It's my scarf," she explained with a sob. He turned to help her, tore the scarf loose, and then, with a strange little whistling sigh, doubled over, with his head lying against the side of the car. "Mr. Randall," she cried. "Sambo! Oh, what's the matter?" There was no answer from him. The engine was still running, the headlights were shining out in the dark. The car was like a living creature, trembling with impatience to be off, but the owner and master of it lay still and silent. Geraldine reached out her hand, and her fingers touched the soft, short hair on his temple. "What shall I do?" she said to herself. "Oh, what shall I do?" For a moment she was lost, panic-stricken, ready to sink down in the dust beside the car and hide her eyes. But not for long. Little by little her native courage flowed back. She grew strong again and tried to face the situation with her old, austere, and straightforward mind. "He's fainted, that's all," she thought. "I must help him. I mustn't call anyone else, because that's just what he doesn't want. It would be unfair and cruel to call anyone else, now that he's helpless." Helpless, this man who, not an hour ago, had been so vividly alive, so headstrong, so impetuous. Such pity seized her that she sobbed aloud. Her hand still rested upon his bent head. She drew nearer and kissed his hair. "Oh, Sambo, dear," she said, "I will help you." Then she set off across the lawn that lay before her, like a vast wilderness. She dared not hurry, lest someone might see her and question her. She had to go at a quiet and ordinary pace, had to restrain her passionate impulse to run. Brandy, she thought, that's what they give people who faint. I'm sure there's some on the sideboard in the dining room. I mustn't be silly. I mustn't let go of myself. She had left him there unconscious and helpless, but she must not run. Nobody else must know. As she passed the front of the house, she heard the sound of music and dancing feet from the drawing room, and she went by, carefully avoiding the bright rectangles of light from the windows. On the buffet were 3 decanters. She was not quite sure which was the brandy, but there was no time for hesitation. She poured out a glassful from what she hoped was the right one and turned toward the window again. A voice spoke behind her. "Caught in the act!" It was Serena. She stood in the doorway, gay and glittering, her face bright with a feverish excitement. "I'd never have thought it of you," she said, laughing. Geraldine stood like a statue with the glass in her hand. It was horrible to her to be caught like this, to be judged guilty as these others were guilty. but it never occurred to her to invent a plausible lie. Serena might think what she liked. There would be no explanation. The girl turned to face her. "I needed it," she said. "It's a pretty stiff," Serena began and stopped short, staring at the girl. "My God," she cried. "What happened? Your scarf!" Geraldine looked down. One side of the scarf about her shoulders was sodden and stained with blood. The glass dropped from her hand and crashed upon the floor, and a sickening blackness swam before her eyes. She stretched out her hands, and they touched nothing. Her knees gave way, and she staggered back. Then, with a supreme effort, she recovered herself. She leaned against the wall, sick and trembling, until the wild chaos in her brain passed by. She heard Serena speaking. Presently she could see Serena's frightened face before her. "What is it? What's the matter?" she was saying. "It's Sambo," said Geraldine with an effort. "He's hurt. Send someone to bring him in." "In here? Where is he?" "Down on the North Road in his car. Send someone—" Serena came nearer. "See here, Geraldine," she whispered. "I can't." "Wait, let's see. Let's think how we can get him away." "I tell you he's hurt," insisted Geraldine. "Send someone." "Hush, not so loud. I can't have him here. You don't understand. I've had the most awful time with Jessie. I had to promise I'd never speak to Sambo again. I simply can't." "I tell you, he's hurt," reiterated Geraldine with a sort of horror. "It may be serious. He may be—" Serena began to cry. "I can't help it. I'm awfully sorry, but I simply can't have any more trouble with Jessie. You ought to see that." "Mrs. Page," said Geraldine, "he may be dying. He's got to be brought in here at once." "I can't help it," cried Serena petulantly. "Sam Randall is nothing to me, and Jessie is simply everything. Jessie's the only man I ever really cared for, and I won't—" "You beast," said Geraldine. Serena stared at her in blank astonishment. It was incredible that the cold and correct Miss Moriarty should have said that. "I'm surprised," she began, but Geraldine would not listen. "A beast," she said again. "You will have him in here, too." "I won't," declared Serena. "Yes, you will," said Geraldine. She stood holding the stained scarf against her heart, and it was as if she held him, as if she were sheltering and defending the man who had done so gallant a thing for her. Wounded and suffering, his one thought had been for her, to protect her good name, to bring her safely home. He was helpless now, and it was her turn. Nothing else mattered. All her stern reserve, her stiff-necked dignity, her pride were flung to the winds. She was ready to fight for him, to defy all the world for his sake. "Send someone out for him at once," she said. "He's been shot, and I know who shot him. It was your—" "Hush! Not so loud, you horrible girl!" "I don't care," said Geraldine. "I don't care who hears me. He's been shot. He's going to be brought in here and taken care of, no matter what it means to you or anyone else. If you won't do it, then I'm going to—" "Wait," whispered Serena. "Oh, what shall I do? Oh, can't you see?" "No," said Geraldine. "I don't care about anything but Sambo." 9. When young Randall opened his eyes again, he found himself back in his room at the Pages. He lay still for a moment, remembering. The window was open, and the dark blue silk curtains fluttered, giving a glimpse of darkness outside. The room was filled with a mild, quiet light. However, he felt sure that someone was there. He could not turn, his shoulder was stiff and painful, and a mortal weariness weighed him down. He tried to speak and could not. All that he could manage was to draw one hand across the cover a little way. But it was enough. Geraldine saw it. She came and stood beside him, grave and lovely as ever, so untroubled, so quiet. "Everything's all right," she said gently. "The doctor's seen you. You're very weak, but he says you'll soon—" She stopped because it was so hard to see him there, white and still, with that mute appeal in his eyes. "You're getting on nicely," she said with sudden brisk cheerfulness. Then he managed to speak. "No," he said in that old defiant way of his. That was more than Geraldine could bear. She knelt down beside him and laid her hand over his. She did not know how to say the words he wanted to hear. She could only look and look at him, with tears in her eyes and a little anxious, trembling smile on her lips. Again he tried to speak, but only one word came. "Love," he said faintly. "End of That's Not Love." The Worst Joke in the World by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Krista Zaleski. The Worst Joke in the World, a story which throws a new and interesting light upon the time-honored problem of the mother-in-law. Mrs. Champney was putting the very last things into her bag, and Mrs. Maxwell and Mrs. Dean sat watching her. The room in which she had lived for nearly 4 years was already strange and unfamiliar. The silver toilet articles were gone from the bureau. The cupboard door stood open, showing empty hooks and shelves. The little watercolors of Italian scenes had vanished from the walls, and the books from the table. All those things were gone which had so charmed and interested Mrs. Maxwell and Mrs. Dean. They were old ladies, and to them Jessica Champney at 50 was not old at all. With her gaiety, her lively interest in life, and her dainty clothes, she seemed to them altogether young, girlish even, in her enthusiastic moments, and always interesting. They loved and admired her, and were heavy-hearted at her going. "You've forgotten the pussy-cat, Jessica," Mrs. Maxwell gravely remarked. "Oh, so I have," said Mrs. Champney. Hanging beside the bureau was a black velvet kitten with a strip of sandpaper fastened across its back, and underneath it the inscription, "Scratch my back." It was intended, of course, for striking matches. As Mrs. Champney never had occasion to strike a match, this little object was not remarkably useful. Nor, being a woman of taste, would she have admitted that it was in the least ornamental. But it was precious to her, so precious that a sob rose in her throat as she took it down from the wall. She showed a bright enough face to the old ladies, however, as she carried the kitten across the room and laid it in the bag. She had often talked to these old friends about her past, about her 2 heavenly winters in Italy, about her girlhood down east, about all sorts of lively and amusing things she had seen and done. But she had said very, very little about the period to which the velvet kitten belonged. It had been given to her in the early days of her married life by a grateful and adoring cook. It had hung on the wall of her bedroom in that shabby, sunny old house in Connecticut, where her 3 children had been born. She could not think of that room unmoved, and she did not care to talk of it to anyone. Not that it was sad to remember those bygone days. There was no trace of bitterness in the memory. It was all tender and beautiful, and sometimes she recalled things that made her laugh through the tears. But even those things she couldn't talk about. There was, for instance, that ridiculous morning when Grandpa had come to see the baby, the unique and miraculous first baby. He had sat down in a chair and very gingerly taken the small bundle in his arms, and the chair had suddenly broken beneath his portly form. Down he crashed, his blue eyes staring wildly, his great white mustache fairly bristling with horror, the invaluable infant held aloft in both hands. If she had begun to tell about that, in the very middle of it another memory might have come. A recollection of the day when she had sat in that same room, the door locked, her hands tightly clasped, her eyes staring ahead of her at the years that must be lived without her husband, her friend and lover. She had thought she could not bear that, but she had borne it, and the time had come when the memory of her husband was no longer an anguish and a futile regret, but a benediction. She had lived a happy life with her children. They were all married now and in homes of their own, and she was glad that it should be so. These 4 years alone had been happy, too. Her children wrote to her and visited her, and their family affairs were a source of endless interest. She had all sorts of other interests, too. She made friends readily. She was an energetic parish worker. She loved to read. She enjoyed a matinee now and then, or a concert, and the conversation of Mrs. Maxwell and Mrs. Dean. With all her heart she had relished her freedom and her dignity. Her children were always asking her to come and live with one or the other of them, but she had always affectionately refused. She believed it wasn't wise and wasn't right. She had stayed on in this comfortable old-fashioned boarding house in Stamford, cheerful and busy. It had been a delight beyond measure to her to send a little check now and then to one of her children, a present to a grandchild, some pretty thing that she had embroidered or crocheted to her daughters-in-law. Her elder son's wife had written once that she was a real fairy godmother, and Mrs. Champney had never forgotten that. It was exactly what she wanted to be to them all, a gay, sympathetic, gracious fairy godmother. But she wasn't going to be one any longer. What her lawyer called a totally unforeseen contingency had arisen, and all her life was changed. He was a young man, that lawyer. His father had been Mrs. Champney's lawyer and friend in his day, and she had, almost as matter of course, given the son charge of her affairs when the elder man died. She had not wanted either of her sons to look after things for her. She didn't like even to mention financial matters to the people she loved. Indeed, she had been a little obstinate about this. And now this totally unforeseen contingency had come to sweep away almost all of her income, and with it the independence, the dignity that were to her the very breath of life. If it had been possible, she would not have told her children. She had said nothing when she had received that letter from the lawyer, such an absurd and pitiful letter, full of a sort of angry resentment, as if she had been unjustly reproaching him. She had gone to see him at once. She had been very quiet, very patient with him, and had asked very few questions about what had happened. She simply wanted to know exactly what was left for her, and she learned that she would have $15 a month. So she had been obliged to write to her children, and they had all wanted her immediately, but she chose her second son, because he lived near us, and she hadn't enough money for a longer journey. Now she was ready to go to his house. She locked the bag and gave one more glance around the empty room. "Well," she said cheerfully, "that seems to be all." Mrs. Maxwell rose heavily from her chair. "Jessica," she said, not very steadily, "we're going to miss you." Mrs. Dean also rose. "Whoever else takes this room," she added sternly, "it won't be you. And I don't care what anyone says, either." Mrs. Champney put an arm about each of them and smiled at them affectionately. She was, in their old eyes, quite a young woman, full of energy and courage, trim and smart in her dark suit and her debonair little hat. But she had never before felt so terribly old and discouraged. She couldn't even tell these dear old friends that she would see them again soon. For in order to see them, she would have to either get the money for a railway ticket from her son, or else invite them to her daughter-in-law's house. It hurt her to leave them like this, and it was only the beginning. At this point, the landlady came toiling up the stairs. "The taxi's here, Mrs. Champney," she said with a sigh. "My, how empty the room does look." So Mrs. Champney kissed the old ladies and went downstairs. The two servants were waiting in the hall to say goodbye to her. She smiled at them. Then the landlady opened the front door, and Mrs. Champney went out of the house, still smiling, went down the steps and got into the taxi. She sat up very straight in the cab, a valiant little figure dressed in her best shoes, with spotless white gloves and her precious sable stole about her shoulders, and such pain and dread in her heart. There was no one in the world who could quite understand what she felt in this hour. To other people she was simply leaving a boarding house where she had lived all by herself, and going to a good home where she was heartily welcome, to a son she loved, a daughter-in-law of whom she was very fond, and a grandchild who was almost the very best of all of her grandchildren. But to Mrs. Champney the journey was bitter almost beyond endurance. She loved her children with all the strength of her soul, but she had been wise in her love. She had tried always to be a little aloof from them, never to be too familiar, never to be tiresome. She had given them all she had, all her love and care and sympathy, and she had wanted nothing in return. She wished them to think of her, not as weak and helpless, but as strong and enduring and always ready to give. And now I'm going to be a mother-in-law, she said to herself. Oh, please, God, help me. Help me not be a burden to Molly and Robert. Help me to stand aside and to hold my tongue. Oh, please, God, help me not to be a mother-in-law. 2. Mrs. Champney had arranged matters so as to reach the house just at dinner time. She even hoped that she might be a little late, so that there wouldn't be any time at all to sit down and talk. She had never dreaded anything as she dreaded that first moment, the crossing of that threshold. Her hands and feet were like ice, her thin cheeks were flushed, anticipating it. She wanted to enter in an agreeable little stir and bustle, to be cheerful, to be casual. But Robert and Molly were too young for that. They would be too cordial. "I don't expect them to want me," said Mrs. Champney to herself. "They can't want me. If they'd only just not try, not pretend." She did not know Molly very well. She had seen her a good many times, Molly and the incomparable baby. But that had been in the days when Mrs. Champney was a fairy godmother, with all sorts of delightful gifts to bestow. Robert's wife had been a little shy with her. A kind, honest girl, Mrs. Champney had thought her, good to look at in her splendid health and vitality, but not very interesting. And now she had to come into poor Molly's house. She was pleased to see that her train was late. She had not told them what train she would take. Perhaps they wouldn't keep dinner waiting. When she got there, perhaps they would be sitting at the table. Then she could hurry in, full of cheerful apologies, and sit down with them, and there wouldn't be that strained, terrible moment she so much dreaded. A vain hope, for as she got out of the train, her heart sank to see Robert there waiting for her. Robert with his glummest face, Robert at his worst. There was no denying that Robert had a worst. He was never wilful and provoking, as his adorable sister could be on occasion. He was never stormy and unreasonable, like his elder brother. But he could be what Mrs. Champney privately called heavy. And that was, for her, one of the most dismaying things anyone could be. She saw at first glance that he was going to be heavy now. "Mother," he said in a tone almost tragic. "But, my dear boy, how in the world did you know I'd get this train?" she asked gaily. "I didn't write." "I've been waiting for an hour," he answered. "You said about dinner time, and I certainly wasn't going to let you come from the station alone. This way. There's a taxi waiting." Mrs. Champney was ashamed of herself. Robert was the dearest boy, so stalwart, so trustworthy, so handsome in his dark and somber fashion, and so touchingly devoted to her. After all, wasn't it far better to be a little heavy than too light and insubstantial? As he got into the cab beside her, she slipped her arm through his and squeezed it. "You dear boy, to wait like that," she said. "Mother," he said again, "by heaven I could wring that fellow's neck, speculating with your money." "Don't take it like that, Robert. It's all over and done with now." "No, it's not," said he. The thing is, you've been used to all sorts of little comforts and so on. And just at the present time I'm not able to give you—" "Please don't, Robert," she cried. "It hurts me." He put his arm about her shoulders. "You're not going to be hurt," he said grimly. "Not by anyone, Mother." His tone and his words filled her with dismay. "Robert," she said firmly, "I will not be made a martyr of." "A victim, then," Robert insisted doggedly. "You've been tricked and swindled by that contemptible fellow. But Frank and I are going to see that it's made right. Oh, Robert, you're not going to do anything to that poor, miserable, distracted man." "Nothing we can do. You gave the fellow a free hand, and he took advantage of it. No, I mean that Frank and I are going to make it up to you, Mother." He might as well have added at any cost. Mrs. Champney winced in spirit, but at the same time she loved him for his blundering tenderness, his uncomprehending loyalty. He meant only to reassure her, but he made it all so hard, so terribly hard. She felt tears well up in her eyes. How could she go through with this gallantly if he made it so hard? Then suddenly there came to her mind the memory of a winter afternoon long, long ago, when Frank and Robert had been going out to skate. She had heard alarming reports about the ice, and she had run after them bareheaded into the garden. She could see that dear garden, bare and brown in the wintry sunshine. She could see her two boys, stopping and turning toward her as she called. Frank had laughingly assured her that there was no danger at all. That was Frank's way. She didn't believe him, yet his sublime confidence in himself and his inevitable good luck somehow comforted her. And then Robert had said, "Well, look here, Mother. We'll promise not to go near the middle of the pond at the same time. Then whatever happens, you'll have one of us left anyhow, see?" And that was Robert's way. The very thought of it stopped the dreaded invasion of tears and made her smile to herself in the dark. Such a splendidly honest way, and so devastating. The taxi had stopped now, and Robert helped her out in a manner that made her feel very, very old and frail. "Wait till I pay the driver, Mother," he said. "Don't try to go alone. It's too dark." So Mrs. Champney waited in the dark road, outside that strange little house. Her son was paying for the cab. Her son was going to assist her up the path. She was old and helpless and dependent. Then the front door opened, and Molly stood there against the light. "Hello, Mother dear," she called in that big, rich, beautiful voice of hers. "Hurry in, it's cold." Mrs. Champney did hurry in, and Molly caught her in both arms and hugged her tight. "Just don't mind very much how things are, will you?" she whispered. "My housekeeping's pretty awful, you know." Tears came to Mrs. Champney's eyes again, because this was such a blessed sort of welcome. "As if I'd care," she said. "Let me show you your room. And Bobbity," said Molly. She took the bag from Robert, who had just come in, and ran up the stairs. Mrs. Champney followed her. All the little house seemed warm and bright with Molly's beautiful, careless spirit. It wasn't strange or awkward. It was like coming home. And the room that Molly had got ready for her was so pretty. "Dinner's all ready," said Molly. "But if you'll just take one look at Bobbity, when he's asleep, Words failed her. Mrs. Champney got herself ready as quickly as she could, and followed Molly down the hall to a closed door. Molly turned the handle softly, and they stepped into a little room that was like another world, all dark and still, with the wind blowing in at an open window. "Nothing wakes him up," whispered Molly proudly, and turned on a green-shaded electric lamp that stood on the bureau. Mrs. Champney went over to the crib and looked down at the child who lay there. The child who was her child, the flesh of her flesh, and was yet another woman's child. He was beautiful, more beautiful than any of her children had been. He lay there like a little prince. His face, olive-skinned and warmly flushed on the cheeks, wore a look of careless arrogance. His dark brows were level and haughty. His mouth was richly scornful. And yet, for all this pride of beauty, she could not help seeing the baby softness and innocence and helplessness of him. He might lie there like a little prince, but he was caged in an iron crib, and he wore faded old flannel pajamas, and beside him, where it had slipped from the hand that still grasped it in dreams, lay such an unprincely toy. Mrs. Champney, bending over to examine it, found it to be a rubber ball squeezed into a white sock. It seemed to Mrs. Champney that she could never tire of looking at that beautiful baby. She hadn't half finished when Molly touched her arm and whispered, "Robert," and, turning out the light, led her husband's mother across the dark, windy room out into the hall again. "I heard Robert getting restless downstairs," she explained. Side by side they descended the stairs. Mrs. Champney was happy with that particular happiness which the companionship of babies brought to her. She had friends who were made unhappy by the sight of babies. They said that they couldn't help looking ahead and imagining the sorrows in store for the poor little things. But to Mrs. Champney this seemed morbid and quite stupid, because when the sorrows came, the babies would no longer be babies but grown people, and as well able as anyone else to deal with them. No, babies were not melancholy objects to Mrs. Champney. On the contrary, they filled her with a strong and tender delight, because of her knowledge that whatever troubles came to them, she could surely help. Because, for babies, a kiss is a cure for so much, and a song can dry so many baby tears, because love, which must so often stand mute and helpless before grown-up misery, can work such marvels for little children. She was happy then until she reached the foot of the stairs, and not again for a long time. Robert was waiting for them there. He came forward with a faint frown and pushed into place 2 hairpins that were slipping out of Molly's hair. It was the most trifling action, yet it seemed to Mrs. Champney very significant. He didn't like to see those hairpins falling out, didn't like to see Molly's lovely shining hair in disorder. He noticed things of that sort, and he cared. He cared too much. There had been a look of annoyance and displeasure on his face that distressed Mrs. Champney. Fussiness, she thought, was one of the most deplorable traits a man could have. It was only another name for pettiness, and that was something no member of her family had ever displayed. Could it be possible that Robert, the most uncompromising and high-minded of all her children, was developing in that way, and with such a wife as Molly? She watched her son with growing uneasiness during the course of the dinner. It was a splendidly cooked dinner. The roast veal was browned and seasoned to perfection. The mashed potatoes were smooth and light. There were scalloped tomatoes and a salad of apples and celery, and a truly admirable lemon meringue pie. But Robert frowned because the potatoes were in an earthenware bowl and the plates did not match. When the splendid pie appeared in the tin dish in which it had been baked, he sprang up and carried it out into the kitchen, to return with it damaged, but lying properly on a respectable dish. "Oh, I'm awfully sorry, Robert," Molly said each time that Robert found something wrong, and there was such generous contrition in her honest face that Mrs. Champney wanted to get up and shake her son. What did those silly little things matter? How could he even see them with Molly before his eyes? "She's beautiful," thought Mrs. Champney. "She wouldn't be beautiful in a photograph. I suppose she'd look quite plain. But when you're with her, when she smiles, it's like a blessing." 3. It was not a comfortable meal for any of them, and Mrs. Champney was glad when it was finished. She offered to help Molly with the dishes, and she really wanted to do so. But when Molly refused and she saw that Robert didn't like the idea, she did not persist. She went into the little sitting room with Robert, and he settled her in an armchair, putting behind her shoulders a plump cushion that made her neck ache. He lit his pipe and began to move about restlessly. "You know," he began abruptly, Molly's not really slovenly." "Robert!" cried Mrs. Champney. "What nonsense!" "Yes, I know," he said doggedly, "but I don't want you to think—" Mrs. Champney did not hear the rest of his speech. She was vaguely aware that he was making excuses for Molly, but she did not stop him. He had said enough. He had given her the key, and now she could understand. It was not pettiness, and Robert was not fussy. It was because he loved Molly so much that he could not endure to have another person see in her what might be construed as faults. If he had been alone with Molly, he wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't even have noticed those things. It was because his mother had come, and he was afraid. It is an old and deep-rooted thing, the child's faith in the mother's judgment. If the mother has been honest and wise, if the child has never been deceived or disappointed by her, then, no matter how old he grows or how far he may go from her, that old and deep-rooted faith lives in him. Robert, at 26, was surer of himself than he was ever likely to be again. He was certain that all his ideas were his own, and that no living creature could influence him. Yet he was terribly afraid of what his mother might think of Molly. For after all, his mother was the standard, and the home she had made for him in his boyhood must forever be the standard of homes. She would see that this home of Molly's was not like that. She would think. "You needn't worry, my boy," said Mrs. Champney gently. "I'm sure I'll understand Molly." And no more than that. It wouldn't do to tell him what she really thought of Molly. It would sound exaggerated and insincere. It would startle him, and it might conceivably make him contrary. So she held her tongue. Presently Molly came in from the kitchen, flushed and smiling, and sank into a chair. "Take off that apron, old girl," said Robert. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Molly. "I always forget." Robert took it away into the kitchen. "Too tired for a song, Molly?" he asked when he returned. "Of course I'm not," she said, getting up again. She was tired, though, and a little nervous, and Mrs. Champney felt sorry for her. But Robert would have it so. His mother must see what Molly could do. He lay back in his chair smoking, with an air of regal indifference, as if he were a young sultan who had commanded this performance, but was not much interested in it. But as a matter of fact, he was twice as nervous as Molly. He had spoken to his mother before about Molly's singing, and Mrs. Champney had thought of it as an agreeable accomplishment for a son's wife, but this performance amazed her. This was not a parlor accomplishment. This big, glorious voice, true and clear, effortless because so perfectly managed. This was an art, and Molly was an artist. "Molly," she cried when the song was done. "Molly, my dear, I don't know what to say." Molly flushed with pleasure. "I do love music," she said. "I often hope Bobbity will care about it." "That was a darn silly song, though," observed Robert. Molly turned away hastily. "I know it was," she said cheerfully. But Mrs. Champney had seen the tears come into her eyes. Molly was hurt. She didn't understand, and unfortunately Mrs. Champney did. She knew that Robert had been trying to tell his mother that Molly could do even better than this, that she could, if she chose, sing the most prodigious songs. He was afraid that his mother would judge and condemn Molly for the darn silly song about the flowers all nodding on yonder hill. "That's what being a mother-in-law really means," said Mrs. Champney to herself. "It means being the third person, the one who stands outside and sees everything, all the poor, pitiful little faults and weaknesses. Love won't help. The more I love them, the more I can't help seeing, and they'll know. They'll always know. When Robert is impatient, Molly will know that I've noticed it, and she'll think she has to notice it too. When Molly is careless, Robert will imagine that I'm blaming her, and he'll feel ashamed of her. That's why mothers-in-law make trouble. It's not because they always interfere, or because they're troublesome and domineering. It's because they see all the little things that nobody ought to see. The little things that would never grow important if a third person wasn't there. I used to feel so sorry for mothers-in-law. I used to think it was a vulgar, heartless joke about their making trouble. A joke? Oh, it's the worst, most horrible joke in the world. Because it's true. 4. Mrs. Champney did not sleep well that night. When she first turned out the light, a strange sort of panic seized her. She felt trapped, shut in here in this unfamiliar room, in this house where she had no business to be and yet could not leave. She got up and turned on the light, and that was better, for she could think more clearly in the light. She propped herself up on the pillows, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and sat there, trying to find the way out. There is always a way out, she thought. It's never necessary to do a thing that injures other people. I must not stay here or with any of my children. If I think quietly and sensibly, I can—" There was a knock at the door. "Are you all right, Mother?" asked Robert's voice. "I saw your light." "Perfectly all right, dear boy," she answered brightly. "I'm very comfortable. Good night." "Sure?" he asked. She wanted to jump up and go to him and kiss him, her dear, solemn, anxious Robert. But that wouldn't do. Never, never, while she had a trace of dignity and honor, would she turn to her children for reassurance. She was the mother. She could not always be strong, but she could at least hide her weakness from her children. She could endure her bad moments alone. "Quite sure," she answered, and snapped out the light. "There, I'm going to sleep. Good night, my own dear, dear boy." "Good night, Mother," he answered. His voice touched her so. If only she could let go and be frail and helpless and allow her children to take care of her. They would be so glad to do it. They would be so dear and kind. "Shame on you, Jessica Champney," she said to herself. "You weren't an old lady before you came here, and you're not going to be one now. You're only 50, and you're well and strong. There must be any number of things a healthy woman of 50 can do. Find them." And then, as if by inspiration, she thought of Emily Lyons. The next morning, as soon as Robert had gone, she told Molly that she wanted to see about something, and off she went, dressed in her best again, and took the train to a nearby town. She was going to see Miss Lyons. She had not met this old school friend for a good many years, but she remembered her with affection and respect, and perhaps with a little pity, because Emily had never married. She had devoted her life to charitable work. An admirable existence, but Mrs. Champney thought rather a forlorn one. Her pity fled in haste, however, when she saw Emily. A very earnest young secretary ushered the caller into a big, quiet, sunny office, and there, behind a large desk, sat Miss Lyons. She rose at once and came forward with outstretched hands. Her blue eyes behind the horn-rimmed spectacles were as friendly and kind as ever, and yet Mrs. Champney's heart sank. The Emily she wished to remember was a thin, freckled girl with a long blonde pigtail and a shy, hesitating manner, an Emily who had very much looked up to the debonair and popular Jessica. This was such a very different Emily, a person of importance, of grave assurance, a person with a large, impressive office at her command. To save her life, Mrs. Champney couldn't help being impressed by offices and filing cabinets and typewriters. She sat down, and she tried to talk in her usual blithe and amusing way, but she knew that she was not succeeding at all. In the presence of this new Emily, she felt shockingly frivolous. She was sorry she had worn her white gloves and her sable stole. She wished that the heels of her new shoes were not so high. She told Emily that she wanted something to do. "Do you mean charitable work, Jessica?" asked Miss Lyons. "I'm afraid I'd have to be paid," said Mrs. Champney with a guilty flush. "You see, Emily, I've had a financial disaster. Of course, my children are only too willing, but—" "They're all married, aren't they?" asked Emily. Something in the grave, kindly tone of her question stung Mrs. Champney into a sort of bitterness. "Yes," she answered. "All of them are married. I'm a mother-in-law, Emily." Miss Lyons did not smile. She was silent for a time, looking down at her polished desk as if she were consulting a crystal. Then she looked up. "We happen to need somebody in the needlecraft shop," she said. "I could give you that, Jessica, at $18 a week. But—" "But what?" asked Mrs. Champney after waiting a minute. "I'm afraid you haven't had much experience," said Miss Lyons. "I've done a good deal of parish work," said Mrs. Champney anxiously. She had known love and happiness with the man she loved. She had endured the anguish of losing him. She had borne 3 children and brought them up. She had traveled a little in the world. She had even known a financial disaster at 50. But in the presence of Emily Lyons, she was ready to admit that she had no experience, that her sole qualification for any useful occupation was the parish work she had done. "If you'd like to try it," said Emily gently. "I've found, though, that women who have led a sheltered domestic life are inclined to be a little oversensitive when it comes to business." Mrs. Champney, into whose sheltered domestic life had come only such incidents as birth and death and illness and accident and so on, said that she hoped she wasn't silly. "Of course you're not, my dear," said her old friend, taking her hand across the desk. "You're splendid. You always were." And Mrs. Champney had to be satisfied with that. She was to begin at the needlecraft shop the next morning. She was at last to enter the world, but instead of being filled with ambitious hopes and resolves, she could think of nothing but how she was to tell Robert about it. The only possible way was to take a mighty high hand with him from the start, And the trouble was that she didn't feel high-handed. She felt depressed and tired and, yes, crushed. That was the word for it. She was not going to let Robert suspect that, however, or Molly either. She decided to take her time about getting back. After leaving Emily, she walked for a time through the streets of the brisk suburban town. Then, seeing a clean little white-tiled restaurant, she went in there and had her lunch. It was noon, and there were a good many other businesswomen there. Mrs. Champney tried to feel that she was one of them now, but somehow she could not. Somehow the whole thing seemed unreal, and even a little fantastic. She mustn't think that it was unreal or fantastic, or how could she convince Robert? She tried to make it real by doing all sorts of calculations based upon $18 a week. With that amount, and with what was left of her income, she could manage to live by herself, somewhere near Robert and Molly, where she could see them and the baby often and yet be independent. Once more she could be a fairy godmother, with sadly clipped wings to be sure, but still able to bestow a little gift now and then. She thought she would get something for Bobbity now, and she bought one of the nicest grey plush animals imaginable. The saleswoman said it was a cat, but Mrs. Champney privately believed it to be a dog because of its drooping ears. Anyhow, it was a lovable animal, with a frank and kindly expression and a most becoming leather collar. On the train going back, she regretfully took out its round yellow eyes, for they were pins, and unless she forestalled him, Bobbity would surely do this. Even then it was a lovable animal, and Bobbity received it with warm affection. He was sitting in his high chair in the kitchen while Molly cooked the dinner. He was almost sturdily neat and clean after his bath, and he was eating a bowl of graham crackers and milk, with a large bib tied under his chin. A model child, yet in the sidelong glance of his black eyes in the direction of the new bow-wow, who was not to be touched until supper was finished, Mrs. Champney saw a thoughtful and alarming gleam. Bobbity was not quite sure whether he would continue being good, or whether it would be nicer suddenly and violently to demand the bow-wow. Mrs. Champney helped him choose the better course. She entertained him while he ate, and then carried him off upstairs with the bow-wow and put him to bed. He became very garrulous then. He lay in his crib clasping the bow-wow, and he told Mrs. Champney all sorts of interesting things in such a polite conversational tone that she felt quite ashamed of herself for interrupting him and telling him to go to sleep. He was nice about it, however. He paid no attention to this rudeness, but pleasantly went on talking. Even when she went out of the room and closed the door behind her, she heard his bland little voice continuing the story of a wild horsie who stampled on 6 policemen. Bobbity was not yet 3, but he had personality. She was smiling as she went down the stairs, until she saw Robert. He came to the foot of the stairs, watching her as she came toward him. She had to meet his eyes, she had to smile again, but it was hard beyond all measure. She had never seen that look on his face before. He had always been utterly loyal to her, had always loved her, but it had been after the fashion of a boy. The look she saw on his face now was not a boy's. It was the profound compassion and tenderness of a man. It came to her with a stab of pain that she had cruelly underrated her son. She had thought of him as a dear and rather clumsy boy, and he was so much more than that. So much more. Her own affair seemed more fantastic than ever now. Here was Robert making his valiant battle in the world for the life and safety of his wife and child. Here was Molly, busy with the vital needs of life, with food and clothes, with the care of their child, and she herself was going to work in the needlecraft shop. She had to tell them, of course. When they were all seated at the table, she did so, in the most casual, matter-of-fact way. It was even worse than she had feared. Robert grew very white. "You mean a job?" he asked. "It's charitable work, really," Mrs. Champney explained. "The foreign-born women bring their needlework to the shop and we sell it on commission for them. The idea is to encourage their home industries and—" "But you're going to get paid for it?" asked Robert. "Why, yes," said Mrs. Champney brightly. "I'm sure I'll enjoy the work, too. I've always—" "You mean you're going off to work every morning in this shop," said Robert. "Do you mind telling me why?" "Because I consider it very useful and interesting work, Robert," replied Mrs. Champney with dignity. There was a long silence. "All right," said Robert briefly. She knew how terribly she had hurt him. He had wanted to do so much for her, to take her into his home and protect her and care for her, and she would not let him. She had turned away with a smile from all that he had to offer. She would take nothing. "I've always led such an active life," she said in a very unsteady voice. "I should think you could understand, Robert." "I do," he said grimly. "You don't," she cried. "You don't. You—" She could not go on. She bent her head and pretended to be cutting up something on her plate, but she could not see clearly. He would never understand that she was doing this only for love of him, only so that she might not be here in his home as the sinister third person who saw everything, and... She started at the touch of Molly's hand on her arm. "If that's your way to be happy, darling," said Robert's wife, and Mrs. Champney saw tears in her honest eyes. 5. Mrs. Champney envisaged her life as divided into epochs, each one with its own significance and its own memories. There was her childhood, there was her girlhood, there were the early days of her married life when she and her husband had been alone. There were the crowded and anxious and wonderful years when her children had been little. There was the beginning of her widowhood, overshadowed with anguish and loneliness, yet with a dark beauty of its own. There was her tranquil middle age, and there was her business life. She had begun it on Tuesday, and this was Friday. It had lasted 4 days, yet it seemed to her quite as long as all the years of her youth. It seemed a lifetime in itself, in which she had acquired a new and bitter wisdom. The train stopped at her station, and with a crowd of other home-going commuters, Mrs. Champney got out and hurried up the steps to the street, to catch a trolley car, but she was not quick enough. By the time she got there, the car was full, and she drew back and let it go. She never was quick enough any more. She seemed to have been transferred into a world of terrific speed and vigor, where she was hopelessly outdistanced, hopelessly old and weary and slow. She had thought, until this week, that she was a fairly intelligent and energetic woman. She had even had her innocent little vanities. But now, standing on the corner and looking after the car, "I'm a silly, doddering old thing," she said to herself with a trembling lip. She remembered all the dreadful defeats and humiliations of the week. She remembered how slow she had been about wrapping up things and making change, how curt she had been with some of the wealthiest and most important customers, how stupid she had been about understanding the Polish and Italian women who brought in their work. She remembered the weary patience of Miss Elliot, who managed the shop. Miss Elliot was not more than 28, but she had been to Mrs. Champney like a discouraged but long-suffering teacher with a very trying child. "Doddering," Mrs. Champney repeated. She was alone on the corner. In this new world nobody waited for anything. Those who, like herself, had missed the car, had at once set off on foot, and Mrs. Champney decided to do so herself. It was less than a mile, a pleasant walk in the soft April dusk. This walk might have been specially designed by Miss Elliot to teach Mrs. Champney another lesson. Only it was a lesson that she had already learned. She really needed no further demonstration of the fact that she was 50, and utterly tired and miserable. It was superfluous, it was cruel, and it made her angry. When she reached the street where Robert's little house stood, her heart was hot and bitter with resentment. "If only they'd let me alone," she thought. "I don't want anyone to speak to me or look at me. I know I'm unreasonable. I want to be unreasonable. I want to be let alone." But of course she couldn't be. Nobody can be let alone, except those who would give all the world for a little tiresome interference. Molly saw at once how tired she was and wanted her to lie down and have dinner brought up to her. Robert, by saying nothing at all, was still more difficult to endure. "I'm not particularly tired, Molly, thank you," said Mrs. Champney with great politeness. What she wanted to do was stamp her feet and cry, "Let me alone! Let me alone! Tomorrow is Saturday and the next day is Sunday. You can talk to me on Sunday. Let me alone now." She sternly repressed all this. She sat down at the table and tried to eat her dinner. She forced herself to remain in the sitting room until 10 o'clock. "In a week or two I'll go away and get a room for myself," she thought, "where I can be as tired as I like." When the clock struck 10, she sat still and counted up to 500, so that she wouldn't seem like a tired person in a dreadful hurry to get to bed. Then she rose, said good night to Robert and Molly, and went upstairs. Even then she would not slight or omit any detail of her routine. She washed, rubbed cold cream into her hands, braided her hair, folded her clothes neatly, ready for the morning, and knelt down to say her prayers. Then she turned out the light, opened the window, and got into bed. And she was so glad to be there, so glad to lay her tired gray head on the pillow that she cried. She was ashamed of this weakness and meant to struggle against it, but sleep came before she had driven it away, a heavy and sorrowful sleep colored with the mist of tears. She slept, then she sighed and stirred in her sleep. Something was coming through the shadowy world of dreams, something imperious and menacing. She didn't want to wake up, but something was forcing her to do so. She heard something calling. She sat up suddenly. It was a child's voice calling, "Mother!" A sound which would, she thought, have reached her even in heaven. "Mother! Mother! I want you!" It was Bobbity screaming that, and no one answered him. "I want you, Mother!" "What's the matter with Molly?" thought Mrs. Champney in a blaze of anger. She got out of bed and hurried barefooted across the room. That baby voice was filling the whole house, the whole world, with its heartbreaking cry, "Mother! Mother!" Mrs. Champney went out into the hall, and there she found Robert and Molly standing in the dim light outside Bobbity's door. Molly, with her magnificent hair hanging loose about her shoulders, her face quite desperate, tears rolling down her cheeks. "What's the matter?" cried Mrs. Champney. "Hush," whispered Robert. "Dr. Pinney said we weren't to take him up. Said it was nothing but temper. I went in to see, and he's perfectly all right. He simply wants Molly to take him up." "But he's so little," sobbed Molly in a smothered voice. "Mother, I want you, Mother!" shrieked Bobbity. Molly made a move forward, but Robert clutched her arm. He, too, was pale and desperate. "No, Molly," he said. "Dr. Pinney told us definitely." "Bah!" cried Mrs. Champney in a tone that amazed both of them. "Dr. Pinney, indeed!" She opened the door of Bobbity's room, went in, snatched him out of his crib, and carried him off past his speechless parents and into her own room. 6. Bobbity's hand was flung out and fell, soft and limp, across Mrs. Champney's face. She opened her eyes. The dawn was stealing into the room, coming like music. One drowsy little bird was awake in the world, piping sweetly. The breeze came, fluttering the window curtain, and it seemed to her that she could hear the footsteps of the glorious sun coming up the sky. All creation waited for him, waited breathless to break into a great chorus of ecstasy when he appeared. Bobbity was waking too. His hard little head bumped against her shoulder. His toes moved softly. He scowled. His great black eyes opened. He looked sternly into her face, and then he smiled. "Grandma!" he said contentedly, and sat up. "We must be very quiet not to wake Mother," said Mrs. Champney. "Why?" asked Bobbity. In his superb arrogance he looked upon his mother somewhat as he looked upon the sun. She existed solely for him. He adored her, and he needed her, and that was why she existed. Mrs. Champney did not trouble to explain. He would learn soon enough how very many other people there were in this world, and that it was not his own world and his own son at all. In the meantime, let him make the most of it. She said that they would surprise Mother, and the idea appealed to Bobbity. He said he would be as quiet as a mouse, and so he was. Mrs. Champney got his ridiculous little garments and dressed him. She knelt at his feet to put on his stubby sandals. She even kissed his feet and his hands and his warm olive-tinted cheeks and the back of his neck. He smiled upon her, condescendingly but kindly. Then she carried him down into the kitchen. He was a plump and sturdy baby, but he was no burden to her arms. She wasn't tired now. Indeed, she thought she had never in her life felt so gay and light and happy. The sun had come, and the kitchen was filled with it. The aluminum saucepans glittered like silver, and the water ran out of the tap in a rainbow spray. She laid the table in the dining room, and Bobbity followed her back and forth, carrying the less dangerous things. There was a wonderful perfume in the air, the intangible sweetness of spring, and with it, and no less wonderful, was the homely fragrance of coffee and oatmeal and bacon. It was a divine hour, and Bobbity knew it. Bobbity could share it with her, he and he alone. He dropped a loaf of bread that he was carrying, and, moved by impulse, kicked it across the room. Mrs. Champney picked it up without a word of reproof. She knew how Bobbity felt. Then she drew the chairs up to the table, and made her great discovery. "There are 4 chairs," she cried aloud. "There are 4 of us. Why, I'm not the 3rd person at all." She was so overcome by this that she sat down and stared before her with a dazed look. "There were 3 already. I'm the 4th. And 4's such a nice number. I can't go away and leave Molly and Robert alone together. They'll never be alone together any more. There's Bobbity. I can help so much. They're both so very, very young, and I could do so much. Molly could have time for music. There are 2 buttons off Bobbity's underwaist. Mother-in-law, indeed." She heard the percolator boiling too hard, and she got up. In the kitchen doorway she met Bobbity with the bow wow. "Bobbity," she said, "do you know something?" "Yes, I do," shouted the child. But Mrs. Champney told him anyhow. "Bobbity," she said, "there's a Lucy Stone League for women who don't want to use their husband's name. I believe I'll start a Jessica Champney League for women who refuse to be called mothers-in-law. There's really no such thing as a mother-in-law, Bobbity. It's just a joke, and a very nasty one. Really and truly, Bobbity, there are nothing but mothers in nature. I think I'll invent some other word. Why not husband's mother, or wife's mother, or—" Molly appeared before her, evidently in great distress. "Oh, Mother darling," she cried, "you shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't be up so early. You'll be tired out before you start." Mrs. Champney stirred the oatmeal, which was bubbling and spouting like molten lava. "I don't believe I will go," she said. "It seems such a waste of time. I think I'll stay home and help you and be a grandmother. I've tried everything else, and I believe I'd do well at that." Molly stared for a moment. Then she ran to the foot of the stairs. "Robert!" she called in her ringing, joyous voice. "Robert! Mother's going to stay home!" End of The Worst Joke in the World